Okay. Okay, we should be chilling now. Alright. So, today, I want to get back into studying Pokemon VGC. That is the plan. As long as my live stream is working, which we should see here in a second, hopefully is. I have no clue. Let me go find out. Okay, it's working. Sweet. So, I've played VGC before, and I want to make. So I played VGC before. I want to make it so I get back into it. I haven't played VGC in a long time, and so that's what we're doing today. So instead of starting like I normally would to get back into VGC and going to Pikalytics, studying, trying to figure out the meta, I want to take it complete fresh start. I want to run a complete fresh start on relearning VGC, relearning everything, making sure that I have all my fundamentals down. We have a good website here. This one is made by Wolfie VGC and some other people. It's called VGC Guide. So this website is like all you need to get into VGC. So if we're gonna go to the introduction to start, 4-minute read. If you're new to competitive Pokemon, we're gonna go from here, coming from breeding or shiny hunting, coming from single battles. So we're gonna say for general introduction, this is the one we're gonna go for. Introduction to competitive Pokemon. Welcome to the world of competitive Pokemon. If you're reading this, Pokemon has probably become a big part of your life. Whether you grew up playing it, watched the anime, you collected the cards, you played Pokemon Go, or you just like Pikachu, you might be curious about what competitive Pokemon means or how Pokemon can even be competitive. Competitive Pokemon is the natural extension of the battles in the Pokemon games. Picking up where the games left off, competitive players battle against each other. There are many different ways to play Pokemon competitively, but this guide and website will focus on the official style of competitive battling, supported by the Pokemon Company. That style is called VGC, which stands for the Video Game Championships. There are a couple things that make VGC unique compared to other forms of battling. First of all is that VGC is double battles. Most of the battles in the mainline Pokemon game, Red, Blue, Sword, Shield, that you might find have been played single battles, one-on-one Pokemon fights, and in VGC, 2 Pokemon fight against 2 Pokemon at a time. VGC battles are fast-paced and all about how a trainer's Pokemon work alongside each other. Coliseum is the first game that showed off double battles. Some of the different gyms in the Pokemon games will use double battles, and then Pokemon Showdown is a really good battle sim that also has double battles, but I think it's mainly focused on single battles for Smogon. It uses Smogons like, yeah. My bad. In competitive Pokemon, you bring 6 and battle with 4. Rather than fighting an opponent with your whole team, you look at their team and pick 4 out of your 6 Pokemon to come battle. This is called a team preview because you send out 2 Pokemon and you'll see half of the Pokemon that your opponent chooses to bring with them as soon as the battle starts. The person who knocks out their opponent's 4 Pokemon first is the winner. So this is team preview. Before every battle, you see the other person's Pokemon, and you can decide which 4 you want to bring out accordingly. There are a lot of Pokemon in VGC. The set of Pokemon that are allowed for use in VGC changes every so often. It's usually called the VGC format or the metagame. VGC battles are always played on the most recent version of Pokemon, which is now Sword Shield. Now, for me, that would be Scarlet Violet. Metagame means a lot of different things, but we'll get to that later. The official circuit is the Pokemon Company and the Pokemon Company International hold a worldwide circuit for VGC that play once a year, accumulating in the Pokemon World Championships, where a world champion will be crowned. Qualification is done by gaining points through battling in person at events ranging from weekly events at your local game store to a once-a-year international championship. This year, the World Championships are in London, England, on from August to August 18th to 21st. That was last year's. This year, it's in Yokohama, Japan. There are also different age divisions for children and teenagers. This changes every year, plus 1 year. Essentially, if you're like 16 and older, I think, you're in Master Ball tier. You're in Masters tier. Seniors is from 13 to 16, and juniors is anything under that. There are lots of ways to enjoy VGC that don't revolve around the World Championships. You can follow along at home, play on the ranked doubles ladder on your video game, or join the community run tournaments online. For me, I'm going to be playing the video game, and we're going to be getting up to Master Ball tier. Here are some reasons why we like competitive Pokemon. You continue playing the games after you beat them. Many people have always become the champion of the Pokemon League, but what comes after that? Competitive Pokemon allows you to do that. To keep playing the game, keep bonding with your Pokemon, keep winning, keep trying to get farther ahead. It's a strategy game. There are lots of different elements and strategies to plan out, from the Pokemon that you select for your team to the moves that you make in battle. Huge amounts of customization. You can customize your Pokemon, you can customize the Pokemon you bring, you can customize their stats, you can customize the moves. You can play how you want to in competitive Pokemon. And there's no technical skill required. It's very different from other esports. The strategic decisions that are made don't rely on reaction time or muscle memory. You have a great amount of time to think before you make a move. And age doesn't matter. So this is a very important thing for me as well. It's not like a game where you have to be able to aim. It's not like a game where you have to have hands to play. You can play Pokemon like with no skills whatsoever. It's all a thinking game. And that's something that I think is really fun about Pokemon 2, where there's no barrier to entry in the slightest. There's nothing to even learn other than the game itself, and the controls, everyone can figure them out. The two main skills of Pokemon battling are team building and battling. In team building, you get to pick the 6 Pokemon that you're going to bring into battle and customize their moves. You can also use a team made by somebody else if you don't want to come up with them yourself. That I'm not doing. Battling, giving your 6 Pokemon and their 6, knock out all 4 of your Pokemon however you can. This is easier said than done. And those are the basics. From here, you're ready to move on to the rest of the guide, where we can get you started on team building and battling as soon as possible. If you don't know how the mechanics of Pokemon stats work, don't worry. We have a light guide on how to get you on board quickly. So I'm not going to be going over the guide on stats. I will be going over everything else though. So we're going to go to Introduction to Team Building and Introduction to Battling. Starting with Team Building. Team Building Introduction. What is team building and why should you care? First steps. Intent. We're going to go to Intent, brainstorming ideas to start teams. Beginning team without team building. I don't want to do this. I don't want to team build. I want to team build. Team building is the really fun part to me. Then concrete building blocks. We are going to go through all of this stuff today. From abstract building blocks, putting it all together, pitfalls. We are running through all of this. Even getting ready for battles. We are running through all of this in order. Start with concrete building blocks, utility moves, speed control, items, protect, trick room. And we'll go to abstract building blocks after we finish these ones. So starting with intent. When you start a new team, add a Pokemon to the team or make the tiniest change to an EV spread or moveset, you have some reasons for doing so. Intent, or the reason behind your decision and choices, is the backbone of all things team building. Intentions can be straightforward. I'm adding Incineroar to my team because it's so good, or highly complex. I'm going to give my Cresselia an 8 speed IV so that it hits 84 speed stat because I want it to move before minimum speed Groudon and Kyogre and Trick Room. It's not the case that every aspect of your Pokemon on your team has to be overly thought out and extensively planned, that it might be overdoing it. Your job is simply to try to understand and accept every piece of reasoning behind the decisions that you made to build your team. When you start a new team, here are some possible reasons you might have for doing so. You want to work with a Pokemon or a mechanic that interests you or excites you. For me, I have a shiny Finizen. I want to make that into a Palafin, and I want to use Palafin. So we're going to be using Palafin for sure when I make my competitive team. Where we're going to get to that in a couple hours, maybe. I want to build I want to build a Groudon team and partner with Gravity. So it's I can't talk. It's Precipitous Blade always hits. You think a team is especially strong and you want to use it yourself. I really like where Xerneas is at in this metagame, so I'm going to build around it. You want to be strong against popular teams. Brunosnarl and Togekiss are everywhere, so I'm going to make a direct team to beat them. Here are some examples of possible intentions for adding a Pokemon to your team. Because you like it or have had success with it in the past, I'm going to add Lucario because it's my favorite Pokemon. Because you think it's strong. Cineroar is one of the best Pokemon in the metagame right now, so I'm going to add it to my team. Because it has good synergy with the rest of your team. I have Tapu Fini and Kartana on my team, so I'm going to add Arcanine, which covers both weaknesses defensively. Because you are weak to another Pokemon type. I'm really weak to Dragon types, so I'm going to add Togekiss. Because it specifically enables one or multiple Pokemon on your team. I want to sweep with weakness policy Yveltal, so I'll add Comfey to help easily activate its weakness policy. Evaluate your choices. Keeping track of intent is important here, because once you get to battling, it's a large part of how you will evaluate how your team is performing. Double battles are dynamic and complex, and it can be challenging to figure out whether you've made a mistake in your play during a battle, or whether your team is underperforming. Understanding the intent behind each Pokemon lets you frame each battle in much simpler terms. Did this Pokemon do what you wanted it to? Why or why not? If a Pokemon isn't performing how you wanted it to, or intended it to, you might want to revisit why it's on your team, or approach battling from another direction. I don't know what my intent is. When you add a Pokemon to the team quickly by following your gut instinct, you're slapping on. There's nothing ultimately wrong with slapping on, because inherently you have some reason for making that choice. It's just that it's implicit rather than fully articulated. When the intention of a team, move, Pokemon, or EV choice isn't clear, it can be a sign that it might require some more thought. This may be part of why it's so hard to use teams made by other players without a guide, or to take EVs from another player. You don't know why these choices were made. If you're stuck on why you added a Pokemon, try brainstorming a few reasons why you think it belongs, or what you might want to do, what you might want from other Pokemon. Working up with others, somebody asks me to take a look at their team, my question will usually be in the form of, why did you do this? Or why did you do that? Why did you make this decision? Then I can help give them some subjective feedback based on whether I agree with their goals and decisions, and hopefully we can come to a consensus about which aspects of the team are good and which need to be changed. If you don't know why somebody did something, ask. There are no stupid questions in Pokemon. You're not only learning more about what the other person's thought process is, which is helpful for you, but you're asking them to put their thoughts into words, which is a useful and important exercise for them. In conclusion, Pokemon is not a game where choices can be made passively. You must always be an active participant. Understanding intention is the first step to doing so. Over time, you'll be able to come up with more and more complex intentions as you practice and grow with the game. And that is what we're looking at for my team building. When we're team building later, I want to be making sure I have a reason to do everything. The only thing I know for sure is I want Palafin because I like Palafin and I have a shiny version. And that's all we know. We're going to keep working based off that. Brainstorming ideas to start teams. Starting points on where you want to begin building. If you don't know how you'd like to begin building your team, I've got a few suggestions to get you started. Feel free to experiment and find some starting points that work for you. Something strong. Be able to identify themes, Pokemon, and strategies that are powerful in the current state of the game is an extremely valuable skill. In Pokemon, it can sometimes be as easy to try and fail to reinvent the wheel. But being able to separate the great ideas from the latest fad can get you a solid starting point. What Pokemon do you think are good? How can you start a team to highlight their strengths? A quote from Wolf, one of the world champions from Pokemon, is, I always take note of Pokemon that are especially difficult for me to play against while playing. Then when I'm thinking about Pokemon I want to use, I consider those same Pokemon I had a hard time dealing with. The metagame is something that okay, I'll just read it. Metagame. Some players prefer to play whatever is currently standard and try to capitalize on the strength of Pokemon that have established success rather than use riskier strategies that haven't proven themselves yet. Players that prefer this approach tend to use teams that have established results and modify them to slightly fit their preferences. What do you think is strong in the metagame right now? Do you like how popular teams are composed right now? Or do you think putting in your own spin on one would make him stronger? For someone new looking to start VGC, content creators are a great way to get a handle on what is currently being used. By watching somebody else play, you can learn which Pokemon are popular, and you can also pay attention to any strategies or Pokemon that interest you, in particular, without having to build a full team on your own. Additionally, many content creators provide rental codes so you can use a team for yourself to get a feel for it on your own. Someone else's idea. Many people ideate with the help of their peers. Although it's human nature to be attached to your own ideas, an equally useful skill is being able to help flesh out an idea somebody else helped you to come up with. Being able to identify good or bad ideas before extensive testing is a very valuable skill in a team building partner. Although this method is less individualistic, when it works well, it tends to produce very powerful teams. Each generation of Pokemon games, and to a certain extent each format of VGC, shifts the Pokemon that are strong. For example, Thundurus' dominance in Generation 5 completely disappeared in Gen 7. Many Pokemon have their time in the spotlight and they vanish once a new generation comes around. One place you can look at when trying to start building it is at Pokemon that at one point were more popular than they are in the current format. This one is probably my go-to method, but it's also the hardest to force. I think about Pokemon idly when I'm awake and brainstorm different ideas that excite me. Maybe you're in the shower, walking around and staring at Cerebi, and an idea comes to you. Congratulations, you have a potential starting point. This will happen more naturally the more time you spend thinking about the game, the format, and the metagame. Maybe you saw something that you thought had potential and you think you can improve upon it. This could be something like changing a Pokemon, adjusting an EV spread, or using a different item that is considered standard. This is also an idea this can also work on ideas that you had that weren't fully fleshed out. Maybe you want to iterate on the idea and take another look. But these are all very good ideas for brainstorming, and we're going to get back to this later. This typing is going to be something that is a very fundamental thing, and we're going to have to pay close attention to it later. So we cannot skip this one. A Pokemon's typing greatly impacts how a Pokemon can use in battle. From resisting damage to getting more damage out of attacks, however, not all types are created equal. The type chart is important, but how your team approaches covering it depends on the metagame and the threatening Pokemon that exist. Typing usually refers to a Pokemon's types in a defensive sense when it's taking damage from attacks. When we talk about a Pokemon's offensive capabilities, we talk about stab attacks or coverage. Typing is useful in the context of Pokemon that are popular in the metagame. If an offensive Pokemon appears on 60% of teams and you have a Pokemon that resists its powerful attacks and can do something useful in return, that Pokemon is likely going to be a good member of your team because of its typing. Pokemon with good typing often have few weaknesses and might not have 4x weaknesses to common types. Another sign is that the moves that do hit them for super effective damage are hard to come by on good Pokemon in the format. For example, in most formats, bug and poison type moves are generally challenging to fit on teams, so you wouldn't need to worry about those weaknesses as much. A Pokemon's typing is also good when it synergizes with the other Pokemon on your team. If a Pokemon has a typing that lets it resist attacks that would deal significant damage to other Pokemon on your team, that's going to allow you to switch more often. This means a Pokemon can have good typing in general, good typing for your specific team, or a combination in both. A Pokemon can only make use of its typing defensively if it has stats to back it up. For example, if you were looking to make use of a fighting bug type defensively, you'll look at Buzzwole before you look at Pheromosa. With Pokemon that have good typing, you can switch in on powerful attacks that threaten your Pokemon on the field. You can even switch Pokemon multiple times in the same game. Once on the field, you can survive attacks and take control of the battle, put pressure on your opponents by making use of both defensive and offensive typing. A note here is that steel types are frequently used defensively due to the amount of the attacks that they resist. Pokemon like Metagross, Bronzong, Dialga are classic examples of steel types that have defense to back up their stats. However, Pokemon like Kartana and Bisharp, while they are certainly steel types, have holes in their defensive stats, as well as important 4x weaknesses that make them much more challenging to use defensively. This is why some players chose to give Kartana the item Assault Vest, which shores up its defense stat and lets it switch in on most fire type attacks. When Bisharp is used, it typically carries a Focus Sash or a Life Orb, and is used for its offensive coverage and strong ability rather than because of its steel typing. Some examples here. A 2019 top 4, James Beck vs Naoto Mizobushi. In this match, we can see the value of a strong Steel-type Pokemon. James' team features the Xerneas, an incredibly powerful, restricted Pokemon. However, Xerneas has the inherent weakness against Steel-type Pokemon. In Game 1, James pays Stakataka enormous respect and uses Incineroar and Amoonguss to position around it, and finally uses Xerneas to deal enough damage to win. In Game 2, Naoto turns a lead that looks bad on paper into an early advantage by using Wide Guard and Gyro Ball with his Stakataka to pick up an early KO on James' Tornadus. As the game progresses, we see that the threat of Stakataka can cause James to not even bring his Xerneas. Due to Stakataka's defensive typing and support from Tapu Fini and Groudon, James is unable to get any damage onto it despite his adaptation, and Stakataka continues whittling away at James' team until Naoto is ready to close out the game. The third game opens with a third set of unique leads from each player. Realizing Stakataka's influence and seeing how the Tornadus Kyogre lead from the previous game has been ineffective versus it, Naoto chooses to bring Stakataka in the back and focuses on eliminating one of its biggest checks in James' Amoonguss, which he takes down turn 1 with an aggressive double target. With Amoonguss out of the way, Naoto is free to set up Trick Room and use strong offensive combinations of Groudon and Stakataka to secure victory. In my opinion, Stakataka was the most crucial Pokemon in this set, in large part due to its steel typing. Combining Stakataka's good bulk with its great defensive typing, we see so many of James' options to damage it were removed by the support Naoto had. Kyogre's Water Spout was blocked by Wide Guard and Desolate Land. Amoonguss can use Spore thanks to Tapu Fini's Misty Terrain, and Kartana was always awkward to bring in general thanks to the rest of Naoto's team. Every single move James had is available to use against Stakataka in games 2 and 3 was mediocre at best. Naoto always had an answer when James couldn't use moves that were really threatening to start Stakataka. What does it mean for a Pokemon to have a bad type? Pokemon can be hindered by their defensive typing. If a Pokemon has many weaknesses and few resistances, or has a 4x weakness to common attacks with no other defensive merit, you won't be able to rely on it. You won't be able to rely on it to take attacks or switch in. If you need that Pokemon for offensive purposes, a bad typing may not be the end of the world. But you'll notice in games that you'll be constrained on when you can switch that Pokemon in, which can be easily exploited by your teammates, or by your opponents. A common misconception is that your Pokemon needs to cover all types offensively. You need to be able to hit every type for super effective, or defensively, you need to be able to resist every attack. In fact, typing is more contextual than that. As mentioned previously, the Pokemon that you'll face frequently determines which typing is important. You're going to want to get a sense of which Pokemon will be attacking you most frequently, or your own experience or usage stats can be a great source of information. You'll want to have some balance on your team's type. However, you don't want a common Pokemon to be able to fly through your team. Excuse me. Make sure that you have Pokemon that can switch in on common attacks for each other. Some of my friends use the Maryland Team Builder to plug in their team and make sure they have a good balance of defense coverage. From there, they cross-reference their output with what they understand in the format and go back to the Team Builder from there. You might be okay with having 3 Pokemon that are weak to Bug type on your team, but if you're thinking about including 3 Fairy type weak Pokemon on your team, you might want to take a step back. So we're actually going to pull this up because I didn't even know about this one. Save that one for later, and then the Team Builder, I'm pretty sure this one is just, Pokemon Showdown. So this one I didn't know, and we're going to get this one in later. Does typing always matter? In restricted metagames or DS Cups, there are a few Pokemon that hit much harder than other Pokemon, and culprits include Xerneas, Primal Groudon, Primal Kyogre, Calyrex Shadow, among others. When the metagame revolves around supporting these Pokemon, it's important that your Pokemon are focused on resisting their attacks, and you can kind of forget about some of the rest of the type chart, because the rest of the Pokemon will appear less frequently, and you won't be getting hit with the same strength. The type chart is one of the first things we will learn about Pokemon, and it's easy that we need to cover it all at once. However, it's much less necessary to have every Pokemon be a different type, or to make sure to cover every type defensively than it is to understand how your Pokemon operate defensively and how typing plays into that puzzle. And now we're going to go into utility moves. So now we're getting into the more nitty-gritty of Pokemon metagame. Everyone knows about typings, everyone knows about type charts. They might not know when you want to use it or how you want to use it extensively, but this is going to be where a lot more people lose their knowledge. When I played Pokemon for the first time, I had a rule for myself. All of my Pokemon only use moves that do damage. Now, while Triple Fire Attack Charizard was enough to beat the Elite Four, in a competitive Pokemon, the norm is a bit different. Nearly all the Pokemon in a competitive match will have between 1 and 3 utility moves that primarily offer support instead of damage. This is defined as a status category move in this game's description. Excuse me. The three categories are physical, special, and status, but there are some discrepancies, so I prefer to define it this way. Some examples of utility moves that do damage are Breaking Slide, which is a weak move that lowers both opponents' attack stats, and Dragon Tail, which forces an opponent to switch, often used as a counter to Trick Room. Some moves are classified as utility depending on the user. Surf is a move that Kyogre could use to deal heavy rain boost damage, while on a weak special attacker intended to activate a partner's weakness policy such as Dragapult to Revile, Surf would be considered a utility move. When determining whether a move counts as utility, ask yourself, is the purpose of this move to do damage or does it have another primary goal? How many utility moves a Pokemon should have varies based on the team and the Pokemon. Most Pokemon will have at least one. The standard for this is Protect, but some Pokemon will choose to use a setup move, like Dragon Dance, Nasty Plot, or a recovery move like Roost, Recover, etc. As a general outline, most Pokemon moveset will look something like Protect, Stab 1, Stab 2, or Coverage, Utility/Coverage. A Pokemon's role will determine what moves it carries. A fast and frail sweeper, like Urshifu, will typically prefer to have several attacks, whereas a bulky support Pokemon such as Cresselia will normally run three utility moves and one damaging move. Now that you have some idea of what a utility move is and how you can fit them onto your Pokemon, let's talk about which specific utility moves are good and why. Moves that I want on every team if I can fit them. Protect allows you to protect your Pokemon while changing other things about the game state, making one of the most important and iconic moves in the VGC. Unlike other moves, there are almost no viable alternatives to Protect. Nearly all Pokemon, except for those holding Choice Item or Assault Vest, can make good use of Protect. For more in-depth explanation of Protect, click here, which we'll get to later. Moves that influence speed control, or manipulating the order in which Pokemon are on the field make a move is one of the most important aspects in a team of VGC. Moves such as Trick Room, Tailwind offer enormous returns if used properly. Some utility moves offer both control speed and double as damage dealing moves, like Icy Wind and Electro Wet, which can pick off low HP targets, hit targets for super effective damage, and grind down your opponent if left unchecked. For a full description of what speed control is and how to use it, look at this article, which we will also get to. For redirection, if you polled VGC players and asked them what the best type of move in the game is, I expect many would say redirection. Redirection refers to the moves such as Follow Me and Rage Powder, which redirect opponents' attacks and forces them to target the user for the turn. Rage Powder and Follow Me differ only in that Rage Powder doesn't work against Pokemon immune to powder attacks, Grass type, Safety Goggles, Overcoat, and Redirection allows Pokemon to completely protect its partner, barring spread moves, thus disrupting your opponent's game plan. Redirection users with Protect can especially be difficult to play against, targeting the opponent with a move that would not be very effective against the Follow Me user, and you're in trouble. But targeting Follow Me users with a super effective attack can leave you in bad shape if the user just protects. Pokemon that are best at redirection have high defensive stats, as their goal is to take as many hits as possible and shield their partners. Most Pokemon that utilize redirection well also make use of disruptive moves that allow them to still exert pressure when they aren't redirecting attacks, such as Amoonguss' Spore. Fake Out is a very weak priority move that flinches the target with 100% certainty, but it only works the first turn a Pokemon hits a field. Fake Out is extremely flexible. It can be used offensively or defensively at any stage of the game, and it's used to trade one of your Pokemon's attacks for one of your opponents, so make sure to only use it when it benefits you. The Pokemon that make the best use of Fake Out typically are bulky and have some ways of swapping out. U-turn, Parting Shot, Eject button, Volt Switch, which allows Fake Out to be used multiple times per game. Alternatively, sometimes fast and frail Pokemon holding a Focus Sash can use Fake Out well. Taunt is one of my personal favorite utility moves because it limits the Pokemon's options and uses your own planning so much easier. Taunt is often used to stop Pokemon that rely on their supportive moves, such as Trick Room setters, Follow Me users, Pokemon that want to put you to sleep, Pokemon that want to recover lost health, etc. Taunt also protects your opponent from using Protect. Excuse me. As I mentioned earlier, most Pokemon will run at least one utility move, and Taunt stops those that don't do damage. Moves that are more situational. These are going to be the status moves. Status conditions can be devastating when utilized properly. A status condition is one of sleep, burn, freeze, paralysis, or poison. Confusion is not considered a status condition as it is cured by switching out your Pokemon, unlike the others. Status conditions offer some sort of negative effect on the Pokemon they are inflicted on. The status conditions are not all equal though, and are not all worth dedicated move slots. Ranked, I would say they're roughly Freeze, Sleep, Burn, Paralysis, and Poison. Freeze is by far the best, however because it only triggers as a low percentage and a secondary effect, you can't trigger it consistently. Sleep is one of the most consistent status conditions in VGC, as Sleep incapacitates a Pokemon for 1 to 3 turns. Players use Spore, Sleep Powder, and Hypnosis to inflict sleep. The low accuracy is sometimes worth it because sleeping a Pokemon are much weaker. Burn is a consistently great status condition as it significantly weakens opposing physical attackers by cutting their attack in half. Players inflict it with Will-O-Wisp. Paralysis used to be one of the best status conditions. However, Thunder Wave, the move that solely applies paralysis, has fallen off as electric types have gained immunity to paralysis in Gen 7. The speed drop was also changed from 75% and 50%, and its accuracy was decreased from 100% to 90%. So it's harder to inflict paralysis on purpose. I strongly suggest that you don't mess around with moves that only inflict poison, as VGC games don't typically last long enough to make the passive damage worth it on its own, even toxic. Screens are referring to the moves Reflect, Light Screen, and Aurora Veil. These powerful support moves that decrease damage to 2/3 of their original value in double battles for 5 to 8 turns. This is different than singles, which is a 1/2 reduction. While the effect of these moves is phenomenal, it's worth noting that some of the Pokemon that use these moves have setting up the screens as their primary purpose, and often faint after getting one or both up. In short, you're playing a 3 vs 4 a lot of the time. And with your 3 Pokemon gaining damage reduction, so this strategy's strength depends on whether the remaining Pokemon can pick up the slack. In the Dynamax formats that happened so far, screens are able to shine due to the extra power Dynamax offers, and how much harder it is to knock out a Dynamax per Pokemon behind the screens. The distribution of Reflect and Light Screen is pretty large, so you might wonder why these moves are so committal on a Pokemon. It seems easy enough to just add one in theory and have it not be a major commitment. The reason is because of the item Light Clay, which turns the 5-turn base of the screens to 8 turns instead. This allows you to get a maximum value out of the screens, but it also makes it harder for the Pokemon using them to fill different roles as the 1 to 2 item as the item and the 1 and 2 moves of the Pokemon are already accounted for. It's worth noting that strategies that rely on screens are typically weaker to getting critical hit, because critical hit ignores the reduction that screens provide, and they are correspondingly more devastating. Lowering your opponent's Pokemon stats is one way of disrupting the game plan. These moves take many different forms. The most common of them lower the opponent's speed, which we touched on earlier. Other moves that have seen play include Fake Tears, which lowers the opponent's special defense 2 stages and sets up for easy KOs. Eerie Impulse, which lowers the opponent's special attack 2 stages, and Breaking Swipe, which lowers both opposing Pokemon's attack stages by 1 stage. Setting up is very difficult in the VGC due to the fact that you're always facing down 2 opponents who can charge you while you're vulnerable. That being said, once a Pokemon has acquired some boosts, it's often much more dangerous. Throughout VGC's history, we've seen many Pokemon do well by setting themselves up. Excuse me, again. While most moves boost either your offenses or defenses, the moves that successful Pokemon typically raise their offensive stats. It's rare to see an unkillable Pokemon succeed. The best set of moves typically fall into one of 2 categories. Some moves raise up one stat multiple stages, such as Sword Sense, Belly Drum, and Nasty Plot, and are best on Pokemon that have either priority or naturally fast. Other raises several different stats, often including speed, such as Quiver Dance, Dragon Dance, or Geomancy. The typical set for a Pokemon that wants to set up is Protect Stab, 1 Stab, or 2 Coverage and Setup move. Setting up a Pokemon is high risk, high reward activity. For that reason, these Pokemon are often paired with supporting Pokemon that can protect them while they're vulnerable. Moves like Fake Out and Follow Me and Rage Powder have the most success thus far for protecting their partners. Recovery moves typically do best on Pokemon that are naturally very bulky and want to gradually chip away at their opponents. A Pokemon can make good use of a recovery move if you expect the most neutral attacks to do a maximum of 40% damage. Porygon 2, Dusclops, and Melodic are all good examples of Pokemon that utilize recovery moves well. Now here we have anti-setup. In some formats, Pokemon that have the abilities to set up are extremely dangerous, and extra measures are needed to stop them. The main culprits are Stat Boost, aka Dynamax Pokemon, Xerneas, and Trick Room. Haze is an easy way to stop Pokemon that accumulate so many boosts quickly because Haze removes any stat changes from both sides of the field, and you can use that as a way to remove your own debuffs in addition to removing your opponent's boosts. Haze is best used on extremely bulky Pokemon that can survive attacks from Pokemon with boosts and reset them after, such as Tapu Fini or Dusclops. Roar, Whirlwind, and Dragon Tail, and Circle Throw are moves that force your opponent to switch, but almost always move last. When a Pokemon switches, any stat changes are reset, so you can use them to stop a setup quickly. However, these moves always fail on Dynamax Pokemon. That's not a problem anymore. Trick Room has the lowest priority out of any move, and always moves last, so you can use these moves to force out an opponent to switch out before they make their move. Be careful, most dedicated Trick Room teams will almost always have some counterplay to Roar in the form of redirection or fake out. For weather, that's one of the most consistent ways of setting up weather, is to use a Pokemon with an ability that sets up the weather. There are times where having one of the weather setting moves can be helpful, referred to as manual weather. Typically only Sunny Day and Rain Dance are used. Since sun and rain are opposite weathers, having a way to get the weather up after your opponent has switched in their weather setter can be valuable. Manual weather is most powerful on dedicated weather teams. For Ally Switch, one of the most controversial moves of all time, a switch is... excuse me. One of the most controversial moves of all time, Ally Switch switches the position of your two Pokemon, meaning any move Pokemon moves aimed at Pokemon 1 will set a land on Pokemon 2 and vice versa. It's a move that is best when your opponent doesn't know you have it, and thereafter forces a difficult decision between both players. I don't personally like Ally Switch, as it's a move that has virtually no effect if your opponent guesses correctly, but that's more of a personal preference. Ally Switch can be beaten by using spread moves, targeting smartly, or hard reading your opponent, which can be inconsistent. It isn't always possible to completely cover for the move in all scenarios, so try dealing with the user before it can force a difficult endgame scenario. Okay, sorry, that was a lot. Just a little bit of a read on that one. But this is a really important one. This is like where stuff starts getting better. Then we're gonna go into speed control. I'm gonna go protect Trick Room before we go into items. I'm gonna save items for last. We'll talk about... Actually, I'll talk about Trick Room... No, we'll talk about speed control, Trick Room, protect, items, in that order. So, let's get started. Although both players input their moves at the same time during a battle, Pokemon move in an order determined by their speed stat. This makes the speed stat one of the most fundamental elements of a Pokemon battle. Moves that alter speed stats or otherwise change the order in which Pokemon move during a turn are referred to as speed control. In this article, we're going to be breaking down the most common elements of speed control so that you can make informed choices for your own team. An example, let's say you have a Ludicolo and a Raichu on your side of the field against your opponent's Togekiss and Scizor. Raichu is much faster than Togekiss, who is faster than Ludicolo, who is faster than Scizor. If nothing changes the speeds of the Pokemon, this is the order they will move in. However, if Raichu uses Volt Switch into something like Politoed and Set the Rain, Ludicolo's Switch Swim will activate and allow it to move next. If the Togekiss is holding a Choice Scarf, it will instead move before the Raichu can even attack. So why is controlling the speed stat so important? Although attacking before your opponent gives you an enormous advantage, if you're able to knock out your opponent's Pokemon before they attack, their move for the turn never goes through. In other words, one of the best defensive moves that you can make is knocking out one of your opponent's Pokemon. The best defense is a strong offense. Hope this metaphor translates. I don't want sports ball. Of course. Furthermore, in Generation 8, speed mechanics were changed. In Generation 1 through 7, speed order is always calculated at the beginning of the turn. However, in Pokemon Sword and Shield, they are now calculated immediately during a turn, which players call dynamic speed stat. Speed control is even more important than in previous generations, because your Pokemon can work together to deliver an attack before your opponents can even respond. There's another benefit to attacking first, and that has to do with passive effects. Many moves in Pokemon won't have a secondary effect that may activate when landing attacks. By attacking first, some effects won't activate, such as Rock Slide finishing, and even ones that do activate, such as Paralysis, Burn, and Freeze, are less devastating since your Pokemon has already launched its attack for the turn. When I was a Wii VGC player, I had a friend named Enfuego, who told me you can't get unlucky if your opponent never gets to make any moves. This is an oversimplification, of course, but there's a lot of truth in the statement. A Pokemon that has been knocked out can't freeze you, parry you, crit you, etc. At first glance, competitive Pokemon appears to have a lot of luck involved. However, the way you play and the way you build your team will significantly influence how lucky or unlucky you get. And one of the best ways to build a lucky team is to ensure that you're always attacking first. This is where speed control comes in. There's a number of methods of speed control, but nearly every successful team makes some use of some form of it. As a personal rule, I like to have at least 2 types of speed control on my team at all times. One second. Sorry, 1 minute. Alrighty. So for types of speed control, Tailwind's effect is simple. After setting up Tailwind, your team's side of the field has their speed doubled for 4 turns. The first turn is the turn you set it up, so 3 effective turns for the setter. Tailwind is a relatively straightforward speed control. Set up Tailwind, Pokemon go through. Tailwind is typically best used by Pokemon that are very fast or can often use the move with some form of priority, such as Whimsicott and Talonflame. Tailwind setups are normally fast and frail, with decent offensive or supporting moves. Teams that function primarily around Tailwind often use Pokemon that are exerting a lot of pressure to make the most of their turns. Tailwind teams by nature struggle pretty heavily against Trick Room teams. It's important to note that Prankster or otherwise very fast Tailwind became even better after Gen 8 was released. If a Pokemon uses Tailwind in the first turn, it instantly doubles their partner's speed for that turn, which means it'll usually move immediately after the Tailwind happens. First turn Tailwind combos can be devastating for opponents to deal with. Trick Room is probably the most iconic and successful form of speed control in VGC history. It's also probably the strongest form of speed control when used properly. Trick Room effect is simple. Reverse the speed order of the Pokemon for 5 turns. The slowest Pokemon will move first and the fastest Pokemon will move last. Trick Room is a form of speed control that you can commit to at various levels. You can build a full Trick Room team, or just have it as a mode or option on your team. Typically, Trick Room teams need a bit of setup to get the move out. This most often takes the form of Fake Out or Follow Me or Rage Powder. Trick Room teams in all shapes and sizes will normally run a super bulky Trick Room setter and an offensive Trick Room sweeper. Because Trick Room reverses the speed order, it's almost always good to counter your opponent's speed control. You can learn more about Trick Room in this article, which we'll get to. Trick Room almost always moves last in the turn due to its -7 priority, so you won't be able to pull off any first turn speed shenanigans of Trick Room in Gen 8, unlike with Tailwind. A less committal way of controlling opposing Pokemon's speed is to make use of moves that drop their speed stat. This most often takes the form of supported moves such as Icy Wind, Electro Web, and occasionally Bulldoze. These moves are less committal of a strategy in the sense that they can be easily added to many Pokemon, but their effect is also less strong as well. All status drop reductions reset upon switching. Furthermore, the drops can be nullified by your opponent raising their speed. That being said, this type of speed control can be invaluable. Speed dropping moves are especially powerful when your opponent is incapable or unwilling to switch their Pokemon out, normally in the late game. Speed dropping moves are relatively low commitment to add onto a team, just 1 move slot. So the reward versus investment is often very high. They're typically used in Generation 8 by very fast Pokemon to offer immediate benefit to a partner, such as Regieleki, or by extremely bulky Pokemon that are difficult to remove and can stick around continuously lowering speed if they choose, such as Melodic or Cresselia. On the opposite end of the spectrum are Pokemon that can boost their speed. Boosting speed is typically considered more useful than dropping your opponent's speed stat, because if you knock out a Pokemon with its speed drop, your Pokemon switches in a Pokemon without a drop. But if you take a KO with your own speed boosted Pokemon, you still have your boost. This is a similar reason to why Tailwind is so strong. The main weakness of speed boosts is that they're often hard to come by. In Dynamax formats, Max Airstream Grout offers great speed control, but apart from that, the moves that raise speed typically have limited distribution. If you can find a good Pokemon that can consistently raise its speed, often with a set of moves such as Dragon Dance or Quiver Dance, there's a good chance it can do quite well. There are other ways to increase your speed stat that don't rely on setup moves, although they typically come with strings attached. One of the most common ways is to use the Choice Scarf item, which allows you to increase your speed by 1.5x at the cost of not being able to switch to your moves after you enter the field. Another method of raising your speed involves the weather abilities such as Swift Swim, Sand Rush, Chlorophyll, and Slush Rush. These abilities are all quite powerful, but they require respective weather to be useful to be up, and thus are susceptible to counterplay. One way you can bypass the different conditions that affect speed is by using moves with increased priority. Priority moves are special in that they bypass other forms of speed control, including everything we talked about thus far. Priority moves typically trade a boosted priority for a lower base power, meaning they deal less damage overall. However, some Pokemon can muster up powerful priority attacks, and even weak priority moves can be invaluable depending in picking off opposing low HP Pokemon or comboing with a partner's stronger attack. Priority moves won't often be a primary form of speed control, but can be extremely strong as a supplementary form of speed control. Pokemon that are naturally fast are invaluable when it comes to considering speed control. While they don't technically affect the conditions on the field that allow you to manipulate speed, what they do is give you the advantage when there is no speed control present, such as on the first turn. Field effects such as Tailwind, Trick Room have a limit, and there's a lot of value in being the fastest Pokemon on the field when those effects run out. Additionally, having a naturally faster Pokemon than your opponent forces your opponent to invest in resources into setting up their speed control, which takes time and has counterplay. A team with all middling slow Pokemon is going to have a much harder time against a far less lucky team than one with a better spread of speeds. It's worth noting that a team composed of only super speeding Pokemon typically struggle due to their naturally poor bulk, so this method of speed control isn't something you can rely on solely. Other methods of speed control are significantly less common than those previously mentioned. The move Thunder Wave applies a paralysis status, which cuts the opponent's speed stat by half. It's only 90% accurate though, and doesn't work on electric or ground types. The move Quash is a move that forces the target to move last within its priority bracket. Quash isn't a bad move at all, but its distribution is limited and its only viable Pokemon that is attacking first, such as Sableye with its Prankster ability. Using the move Trick while holding the Lagging Tail gives your opponent a bad item and forces them to always move last in the priority bracket, like a permanent Quash, and steals their item. Prankster Pokemon such as Whimsicott, Grimmsnarl, and Sableye will use the first move Trick while holding a Lagging Tail. This combination is considered a bit gimmicky and doesn't see much play in non-Dynamax formats. The move Speed Swap is a fun move that swaps the speed of a target and the user, but hasn't seen nearly any success in VGC. These moves can be good situationally, but aren't consistent enough that I would recommend them in a good general case. For wrapping up, which form of speed control should you want on your team? It depends on your team and your preferences. Furthermore, different types of speed control are stronger in different formats. In formats with many fast and frail Pokemon, Trick Room is even stronger than normal. In a format with many bulky Pokemon with good defensive tools, Tailwind-centric teams may struggle more. Ensuring you have a good speed control on your team will go a long way in giving you the more tools to win and handle negative variants. As you play more and get more experience, you may learn that you prefer certain types of speed control over others. Don't forget that these strategies aren't mutually exclusive. You can always mix and match to build the strongest team. And going off of speed control, we're going to talk about Trick Room as well. Trick Room is a move that reverses the order in which the Pokemon move for 5 turns. Under the effective Trick Room, the Pokemon with the lowest speed stat moves first, and then the second lowest, and then the second highest, then the highest. Trick Room does not affect move priority. Trick Room itself has a minus 77 priority, which is the lowest the priority an attack can be, meaning it is almost always the last move used, unless there's some other trickery with other moves that affect the move order. Even though technically Trick Room lasts for 5 turns because it's always set up last, its effect is only relevant for 4 turns. Trick Room has multiple strengths. Some strong Pokemon have low speed stats as to counterbalance their high offensive and defensive stats. Trick Room turns a large negative into a huge positive. Furthermore, most non-Trick Room Pokemon will want to invest their speed stat in order to move before other Pokemon. Trick Room Pokemon very often don't invest at all into their speed stat, giving them extra EVs to compare to other Pokemon to now invest into other stats. Trick Room is much stronger in VGC than it is in singles. You have twice the amount of Pokemon to take advantage of in Trick Room compared to singles, and it lasts for a long time, 5 turns. Additionally, Trick Room has not only been a good option, but a dominant one in every VGC format historically. It has won 7 of the 12 World Championships, which is highly consistent. The classic Trick Room team includes 2 of the Pokemon to set Trick Room, the setters, 1 to 2 Pokemon to help Trick Room get up, the helpers, and 1 to 2 Pokemon to deal the bulk of the damage in the Trick Room, sweepers. This style of a team, called a hard Trick Room team, is typically strong if a Trick Room goes up, and much less strong otherwise. To circumvent this, some dedicated Trick Room teams make use of an alternative mode in case they can't get Trick Rooms up. Players will run fast Pokemon even on the most dedicated Trick Room teams. There's no real hard fast rules when it comes to building Trick Room teams. Some teams that utilize Trick Room can have as little as 2 Pokemon that make use of it, but still maintain the strategy as an option. It's even possible for a mid-speed team to get a good use of Trick Room with only slow Pokemon. There are certain consistent rules that Pokemon Trick Room teams tend to fall into. These are generally classifications that appear across generations and formats. There are 3 major categories: Trick Room setters, Trick Room helpers, and Trick Room sweepers. Note that not every Trick Room team needs all 3 categories. Every Trick Room team needs a Pokemon that knows the room Trick Room, a setter. The only requirement of a Trick Room setter is that it knows the move Trick Room. They typically fall into one of 2 categories: bulky setters or offensive setters. A bulky Trick Room setter often trades offensive capabilities for its survivability. It's a Pokemon whose primary goal is to get Trick Room up and then offer support once it goes up. Pokemon like Cresselia, Dusclops, and Porygon 2 fall into this category. There are offensive Trick Room setters. These Pokemon often need some support in order to get Trick Room up. But once they set up, they are able to function as a strong offensive threat, allowing immediate offense without the need for repositioning. Hatterene and Rudiclus are some of the best examples for offensive Trick Room setters. Some Trick Room setters are the exceptions to this bulky offensive split. For example, fast frail Pokemon such as Neolego, Whimsicott, and Gengar are normally selected to be surprise factor or as anti-Trick Room tech. For Trick Room helpers are typically Pokemon whose primary goal is to protect your Trick Room setter and to allow them to get Trick Room up. They are normally selected due to a low speed stat in addition to their access to strong support. The 2 most common ways of setting up a Trick Room setter are Fake Out and Redirection. Fake Out is a great way to stop one of your opponent's moves, meaning your setter only needs to withstand 1 attack in order to get Trick Room up. In Dynamax formats, Fake Out is less useful due to Dynamax's immunity, but this does not matter. We're no longer in a Dynamax format, we have Terrestrialization now instead of Dynamax for Generation 9 Scarlet Violet. Redirection refers to moves that Follow Me and Rage Powder, which draw attacks away from your Trick Room setter. These Pokemon tend to be defensively oriented, but offer low offensive pressure, especially if paired with a defensive Trick Room setter. Perhaps counterintuitively, one of the best outcomes of a turn 1 in a battle is that a redirector is knocked out, which allows a free switch under a Trick Room to a more offensive Pokemon. Each redirector can be disruptive in their own way. However, Amoonguss uses Rage Powder, and if not KO, can follow up with Spore. Indeedee Female uses Follow Me and can follow up with Psychic Terrain boosted Expanding Force. Defensive redirection Pokemon tend to perform better when paired with an offensive Trick Room setter, though they can work in many situations. Trick Room sweepers are Pokemon that tend to be heavy hitters under Trick Room. They tend to be bulky and hard hitting and very slow. The goal of a Trick Room sweeper is to do as much damage as possible before Trick Room expires, so having a good coverage and being difficult to switch into are huge pluses. However, once these Pokemon are caught outside of the Trick Room, they will almost always move last, which is a significant disadvantage. Trick Room Sweepers tend to carry the offensive items like Life Orb and Defense and Weakness Policy. Rhyperior, Torkoal, and Glacier are good examples of Trick Room Sweepers. There are specific Pokemon, moves, and items that you can add to your team to make it more difficult to get Trick Room up. There's also general ways of playing a game that are effective at stopping Trick Room, which we'll talk about here. Here are things you can put on your team to help you versus Trick Room. The move Taunt stops all status moves as long as the target Pokemon isn't holding the Mental Herb. Moves that force switches upon, such as Roar and Dragon Tail, move before Trick Room and force the setter out before Trick Room goes up. Using Trick Room when Trick Room is up cancels the effects of Trick Room. A Pokemon knowing both Imprison and Trick Room and then using Imprison makes it so your opponent can't use Trick Room until your Prison user is KO'd or switched out. You can also make use of your own slow Pokemon and that benefit from your own opponent's Trick Room. However, be careful. Trick Room teams often have counterplay in the early game for all of the above strategies. Mostly in the form of their support Pokemon, though obviously some methods are easier to deal with than others. These are good strategies to consider though, and especially after adding the move Taunt, which is highly flexible, putting slow Pokemon on your team, which are useful in many situations. In summary, Trick Room is one of the best and most consistent strategies of all time. There's a whole spectrum of ways you can integrate into teams and various types of Pokemon that can benefit from the Twisted Dimensions. Playing against Trick Room requires smart positioning and planning, in addition to having the tools to handle it in the first place. It's also very fun to use and rather straightforward to grasp the basics of. If you haven't tried it before, I personally recommend it. So we only have 2 left. We're not going to go to battling today. We will go back to battling after we build our team, and that will not be today. So we're going to go through Protect and Items, and after we go through Protect and Items, we will have more. We're going to take a break, and then we'll go to this section. Go to Abstract Building Blocks after I take a break, because we've been here for what? Basically an hour already, right? So we're gonna keep going, but Protect. What is Protect? If there were more than one move that defined the VGC in its entirety, it would have to be to Protect. Newer players are often surprised to see the prevalence of Protect in VGC. After all, it's a move that doesn't actually do anything offensively and can't be used consecutively without high risk of failure. Let's use a very basic example. I have a Pikachu and I don't want to deal with my opponent's Onix because there are no sprinklers around and Onix is immune to all of my electric attacks and threatens to knock out my Pikachu with ground type moves. If this were a single battle, Protect wouldn't do anything for me. I can use Protect to stall out a turn, but my problem still remained the next turn. The Onix is still around, there are no sprinklers to be seen. But what if this is a double battle? See in Showdown here. So you can see in a single battle, it doesn't really do anything for you. But if this is a double battle, things can change a bit. Say I have the Bulbasaur next to my Pikachu, which can KO the Onix. Onix is still threatening to KO my Pikachu, but now the dynamic is totally different. If Onix wants to attack my Pikachu, it risks being KO'd in return by Bulbasaur. Now the Onix player could choose to trade their Onix for my Pikachu, and if they still decide that's in their favor, but if I choose to protect my Pikachu, then they lose the Onix and gain nothing. This creates a mind game centered entirely around Protect and which of the players will choose to use it. So here you can see, I think this is a really good replay, by the way. I really like that they incorporate Pokemon Showdown replays as examples. So why is Protect important? As seen in the example above, Protect allows you to control the pace of the game. If a Pokemon of yours is being threatened, you can always protect it while its partner attacks, potentially removing the threat. This makes it so that your opponent isn't always safe to attack you and adds uncertainty when they go and make their move. Protect is a defensive tool that is often used for positioning. If you have two Pokemon that you want on the field together, but only one of them is currently out, you can protect it and switch in the other. This lets you navigate to the board for states that are favorable for you. Protect also pairs well with supportive Pokemon, many of which are bulky. Protect allows you to shield an offensive damage dealer, while you bring in the proper support for it. Take out, Intimidate, Follow Me, Rage Powder, Tailwind, etc. Being able to keep your high damage output Pokemon safe is a really valuable asset. The longer they survive, the more damage they can deal. Protect allows you to waste turns where your Pokemon would otherwise have an advantage. Where there are many effects in competitive Pokemon that have a set number of turns, Trick Room, Tailwind, Weather, Terrain, Dynamax, etc. If an opponent sets Tailwind turn 1, they would normally have 4 turns total to make use of its effect. But if both Pokemon on your side of the field have Protect, you can completely nullify 2 of those turns by protecting both of your Pokemon. In this replay we see, so here's an example. They draw out the Tailwind by having a lot of Protects out. In short, Protect is a positional tool that allows you to keep your options open. More than that, it makes decisions hard for your opponent. Attacking into a Pokemon that using Protect will most often be a wasted move. However, you never know if a Pokemon is actually going to Protect until it does, so your opponent can't safely ignore your Pokemon. Which Pokemon need Protect? Most Pokemon in VGC will carry Protect. It's worth noting that not every Pokemon needs to run Protect, and some Pokemon make better use of it than others. Pokemon that are extremely bulky, such as dedicated Trick Room setters, often opt not to run Protect, as do most Pokemon holding a choice item. Occasionally, an extremely offensive Pokemon will opt not to run Protect in favor of more coverage moves, but this is also pretty risky. In a Dynamax format, we're not in Dynamax format, Pokemon opt to use a different status move because when they Dynamax, blah 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 blah. Pokemon that are supportive in some regard also sometimes opt to run Protect. Sorry. Pokemon that are supportive in some regard also sometimes opt not to run Protect. This often includes Pokemon moves such as Fake Out or Pokemon with the ability to light, screen, and reflect. These moves often serve as a sort of pseudo-protect. Fake Out allows you to nullify your opponent the first turn the Pokemon is in battle. A dual screens for reflecting light screen provides significant damage reduction. Additionally, by running Pokemon with the aforementioned move, you only have 2 or 3 moves remaining, and adding another defensive move, Protect, can sometimes result in a Pokemon that simply can be ignored and not have any presence. Therefore, on a support Pokemon that is already defensively inclined, Protect is sometimes dropped. Certain teams make better use of Protect than others. If a team plays more aggressively and aims to overwhelm the opponent with offense, additional offensive moves may be better suited for that team instead of Protect. However, a team that is more defensively oriented and requires a lot of switching and positioning can get more use out of Protect. When deciding whether or not to run Protect on one of your Pokemon, there's a few things you need to consider. Think about how much damage your Pokemon will be taking on average. If it's 50% or more from a chunk of the metagame, that's a very good reason for you to run Protect. This also explains why extremely bulky Pokemon such as Cresselia, Dusclops, and Porygon 2 cannot justify using Protect. You should also weigh what's the next best alternative for dropping Protect from your moveset. If you're weighing Protect versus another offensive coverage move, considering how long you'll be able to survive without Protect, extra coverage isn't especially useful if your Pokemon has already fainted. Bulky Pokemon can opt to not run recovery moves instead of Protect. If you're taking less than 50% for most attacks, this may be a good alternative. Wrapping up, Protect is one of the most fundamental parts of VGC battling. There's no hard and fast rules when it comes to using Protect, but it's one of the best moves in the game, and in my opinion, you need a really good reason to not use it on a Pokemon. If you're unsure whether a Pokemon on your team needs Protect, play some games without it and see how much you miss it. As you get more experience in VGC, you'll start to develop your own sense of which Pokemon need Protect and which can afford to drop it. Don't be afraid to experiment and get a feel for what you like. Lastly, in the first section, we have items. In this article, we'll talk about what items we consider when we're building a team and help you find an item if you're stuck. If you haven't played competitive before, check out the basics of items in competitive play section. If you have, skip that section and continue to what items should I use section. When I tell people unfamiliar with VGC that I play Pokemon competitively, a question that quickly arises is, so do you just spam revives or potions? Well, I always make sure to tell the asker that this is a quite good idea and I will try next tournament. A trainer cannot use items during a competitive battle. However, Pokemon can hold items and use held items themselves. A held item is a subclass of general item that you equip to a Pokemon and they take effect during the battle. Items such as potions, revives, X accuracy, and many others are not held items and therefore cannot be used. For a full list of held items, click here. VGC has several clauses and rules that affects the team you can legally bring to a tournament. One of these clauses is known as item clause, which states that each item you use on your team must be unique. Each Pokemon can hold one item, meaning competitive VGC teams will have a total of 6 different held items. Choosing an item can feel overwhelming. After all, there's quite a few possible items to hold. You have to choose 6 distinct ones. Is this a fool's errand? Are you destined to stew in the itemless purgatory indefinitely, suffering to choose paralysis akin to the best 6 ice cream flavors in a store with hundreds of options? Well, even though there are hundreds of possible items, many of these should be immediately discounted when considering itemization. Many items are inferior versions of existing ones, such as Oranberry versus Citrus Berry. When considering an item is good, there are a few things to consider. First, consider how often your item is likely to activate. Some items are always active, such as choice specs, leftovers, etc. Whereas some items need conditions to be met, such as Citrus Berry or Weakness Policy. Some items need Battery, Snowball, Utility Umbrella aren't going to come into the majority of the games. Next, consider the benefit the items provide. The +1 boost you get from an Absorb Bolt isn't as impactful as the +2 boost from Weakness Policy, and is only marginally better than the boost Life Orb provides. Some items activate often, such as Big Root, but provide very little value. Furthermore, how good an item is depends largely on the Pokemon holding it. Focus Sash like Shedinja is likely the best option, or is likely its best item, but Focus Sash Snorlax is going to be useless most of the time, because so few Pokemon tend to take all of its HP in one turn. Finally, consider the opportunity cost of your item. Is there a better item you could be using? One primary example of this is the Air Balloon item, which makes a Pokemon immune to the ground moves until it is hit by an attack. Sorry about that. Where were we? Here we are. Ugh. This item is inconsistent, and you may not be able to count on it, as it's always active when you need it. And smart players can maneuver around the effect. In this case, most Pokemon that want to hold Air Balloon would fare better with a Focus Sash or a Shuka Berry. There are no hard counters or hard rules and fast rules when it comes to items, but these questions should give you some guidance when it comes to considering your items. In most formats, there are probably 10 to 15 held items that are most common, with the rest being situationally strong. However, good specific items is largely dependent on the Pokemon holding it and the rest of the metagame. But most items fall into 4 general categories: recovery, damage output, damage mitigation, and support. Recovery, it's not rocket science. When your Pokemon can't battle when they run out of health, so people use the items that recover HP. These include Citrus Berry, leftovers, and the berries that restore 33% of your HP, which are Figgy, Mago, Agov, and Wiki, and La Papa berries. Citrus Berry is typically the best on a Pokemon with middling bulk to significant bulk. Pokemon that on average will take 2 to 4 hits to knock out. Leftovers is strongest when a Pokemon intends to stick on the field for multiple turns, such as gradual setup sweepers like Calm Mind Tapu Fini, and increase their bulk with offense. Leftovers are often useful on Pokemon that have other forms of passive recovery, such as Leech Seed or Grassy Terrain, as you get additional recovery from protecting. Berries that restore 33% of your health are a good alternative to Citrus Berry on Pokemon with significant bulk, as they're likely to reach the activation threshold consistently. They can also be useful on Pokemon with a recoil move, as it's easier to activate these berries with yourself in a pinch. Damage output. Don't you want your Pokemon to do more damage? Well, thanks to these items, they can. Some examples of damage items include Life Orb, Choice Specs, Bands, Weakness Policy, and typical type boosting moves such as Miracle Seed or Mystic Water. Where these items belong are dependent largely on the format, but in general, it's important to consider the power versus drawback balance. The strongest of the items, choice items, and Life Orb have somewhat sizable drawbacks that the weaker alternatives lack, but in exchange of more power. When deciding on which item you want, consider how the drawbacks affect the Pokemon you're itemizing. A Pokemon that clearly has the best move, whose primary goal is to do damage and doesn't need defensive item options like Protect, may be better off with a choice item. A Pokemon that runs multiple moves of the same type and values defensive options, or the ability to switch moves, may prefer type boosting them. For damage mitigation or survivability items don't restore health, but they do allow your Pokemon to stick on the field longer by reducing incoming damage. Assault Vest, type resistant berries such as Sugar or Cobble Berries, and other items like Focus Sash and Eviolite. These items are good on Pokemon that need help staying on the field for whatever reason, and attempt to reduce the specific weakness to provide longevity. Survivability items can be used either to increase the somewhat bulky Pokemon staying power, or to allow a frailer Pokemon on another turn on the field. Support items that typically bolster something about a Pokemon that doesn't fit into one of the other three categories. Some of the better examples include safety goggles, Lumberry, and Light Clay. These are items that have specific purposes, help with power moves, help with sleep, or help increase the duration of light screen and reflect. As such, the types of Pokemon that they excel on depend largely on the niche being filled. So how do I choose an item for my Pokemon? Nearly every good item choice on a Pokemon will do one of the two things for a Pokemon. Bolster a strength or mitigate a weakness. Let's look into this a little deeper. Does your Pokemon naturally threaten high amounts of damage, considering either Choice Band, Choice Specs, or Life Orb to become even more threatening? Is your Pokemon threatening because its output is big damage and also has good staying power? Consider a type boosting move like Magnet or Citrus Berry. Is your Pokemon a defensive wall who wills away at a Pokemon's life, such as Ferrothorn or Celesteela? Consider increasing its staying power with leftovers. Is your Pokemon most threatening when moving first? Consider the Choice Scarf item. But these are just a few examples of things you might consider when augmenting something your Pokemon does well. Experiment with different items so you can learn which Pokemon they're strongest on. Oh, whoopsies. Is your Pokemon weak to a common type in the metagame? Consider a type-resistant berry such as Sugar Berry. Does your Pokemon need help staying on the field longer to help benefit more special defense? Consider it as Assault Vest. Is your Pokemon fast and frail and find itself getting knocked out in one hit? Consider Focus Sash. Is your Pokemon getting KO'd in 2 hits often? Consider adding a Citrus Berry. Does your Pokemon keep getting put to sleep by Spore or Sleep Powder? Consider adding Safety Goggles. It's worth noting that these questions are about the Pokemon we're using, not the items themselves. You can add the same item, such as Citrus Berry, to either bolster a strength or mitigate a weakness. As you get more experience with the items, it'll become easier to identify what each of your Pokemon needs. If you're just getting started in VGC, I recommend seeing which items are popular and staying mostly inside of that box. As your game knowledge progresses, you can start thinking about items more conceptually and identifying the situations where less conventional items may be appropriate. I hope this guide gives you the tools to think about itemization and the specific job your items are doing. And that it does. So now, we are going to move on to abstract building blocks soon. We have quite a bit to go before we cover everything, but I'm going to take a break now, and I will be back to cover the abstract building blocks. And this one might be just a wee bit long. This one might take another hour or two. So I'll be right back. Give me 10 minutes or so, if not longer. Probably 10 minutes. There we go. And I'll be back. Okay, sorry, I'm back. So let's keep it going where we left off. What makes a Pokemon good? Wolf released this video where he talks about one of the first things we should think about in terms of team building. They use the good Pokemon rule, or more concretely, the Pokemon on your team should be good under your team building philosophy. This isn't to say though that you should only use the highest used Pokemon with the best stats. And this article will help you think about what this rule means in your own good terms. What makes a Pokemon good? Being able to identify what a good Pokemon is a more important foundation skill, in my opinion, than being able to make a good team. What does it mean for a Pokemon to be good? It does not mean that the Pokemon has a high usage rate. Good Pokemon often have high usage rates, but many Pokemon that are good do not. Maybe cheekily, the definition of what a good Pokemon is a definition that you'll have to come up with yourself. What do you have to value in a battle? What do you think are the best ways to win? These are principles that you hold dear based on your experience as someone learning to play this game. This is of course extremely subjective, all of Pokemon is. I have the things in my head about what I think makes a Pokemon good, but that's different from what you might be thinking of. The path to victory in a Pokemon battle is so complex that all we're able to do is come up with our own principles and philosophies on battling and team building, and refine them endlessly. If you're new to this game, it's okay to not have principles. It's okay to have principles that you think might be wrong or based on little experience. You'll pick up things as you go along. What's important for you is that you identify things and in the end you feel like you're having fun and learning. Pokemon is a game about endless learning, so you might as well start now. When you pick your Pokemon for your teams, are you picking Pokemon that meet your criteria or help further your goals? Or are you adding band-aid fixes to support what you think are holes? If you have to include a Pokemon that doesn't meet your criteria, if you don't think it's good, but you're putting it on your team anyway, you need to take a step back and think about your team from a different angle. If your team isn't working out, revisit your principles of why each Pokemon is on your team. At one point, what you thought that each of these Pokemon was good and was a good fit for your team. Why did you think that? Is that decision working out how you wanted it to? Considering other people's opinions. Much as how you have had some idea of what Pokemon are good, other players are having their own perspective. Taking in the opinion of other players, whether through conversation or watching videos, is a great way to learn and refine your own philosophy. Beware of being told that a Pokemon is good and being told why. If you're hearing it from a better player, they might assume that you know the context behind why they would think that Pokemon is good. You might not. It's okay to not know what makes a Pokemon good under their definition. They defined that for themselves and they then didn't tell you directly. Ask them to put in their own words why a Pokemon is good, or hypothesize and put it into words yourself. At worst, that person slapped the Pokemon onto their team without considering why. They just thought it was good in general. In this guide, we caution you fully think through why every Pokemon makes it onto your team. You define what makes a Pokemon good under your own principles. Take the time to understand why you want it to be on your team and whether reality will play out as you envision it. Your Pokemon will be better for it. Different people might have different opinions on what makes a good Pokemon based on their own principles and experiences. I want to urge you to think through what a good Pokemon is for yourself and not to rely on other players to decide for you. Remember what you're in charge of. Remember that you're in charge of your own Pokemon. What are our criteria? Maybe it would just be helpful to hear what we consider markers of good Pokemon, but please take our opinions as just that, opinions. For Aaron Chandler, good Pokemon fundamentally challenge your opponent. The best Pokemon are the ones that do so much the other Pokemon are allowed to in the format. The other Pokemon allowed in the format simply don't have enough tools to deal with them. This is heavily linked to the concept of consistent strategy. A Pokemon should be strong enough to either have enough tools to give your opponent problems, even if your opponent is prepared for them. I think the best Pokemon of all time is Xerneas in the VGC 2016 and 2019 metagames. Xerneas commanded so much power and was so flexible with how it could set up that players were forced to run multiple checks and counters to begin to deal with it. And even then, it still ran away with the games thanks to a flexible supporting cast. That isn't to say that strength is the only aspect that makes a Pokemon good. Pokemon that accomplish many goals, such as Incineroar, can sometimes be similarly rise above the capabilities of your opponent. Being good like everything in Pokemon is always in context. For example, Amoonguss's useful defensive typing, stats, and moves are a variety of reasons why I would consider it for my teams. Is Amoonguss good in the context of whatever format is being played in? Well, then I'd have to consider how popular anti-sleep options are, such as Taunt, Safety Goggles, or Misty Terrain. How useful is its defensive typing going to be if Fire or Flying type Pokemon are everywhere? Furthermore, do all of these factors occur naturally because these Pokemon are good too? Or are they in response to Amoonguss for itself? In the former case, Amoonguss might not actually be a good Pokemon because it is disadvantaged from the strat. However, in the latter case, the format has evolved to respect Amoonguss and its tools. That is its strength. If Amoonguss can be feared enough that people will willingly shift their teams around it, and despite that respect, I can still find useful situations for it, that is the marker of a good Pokemon. Wolf would say a good Pokemon need to meet certain criteria in mind. The most important thing a Pokemon needs in order to be good is its field presence. The ability to impact the game by being on the field. This can be via damage output or like I would support with Incineroar. Without the ability to consistently impact the game, a Pokemon risks being able to be ignored, which is extremely bad in VGC. Consistency is another extremely important factor to consider, both in strategy and in gameplay. I value Pokemon that don't lose significant value once the opponent knows their moveset and item. I also value Pokemon that reduce negative variance like I am susceptible to, like Tapu Fini, and I dislike Pokemon that force me to gamble, like Venusaur. I value the base stats of Pokemon highly. For a Pokemon to be good, it needs to be able to do something. And for nearly every Pokemon, for what they are capable of, comes down to their base stats. Not every stat needs to be especially great. Raichu is an example of a Pokemon I think is good despite only having one good stat, speed. But Pokemon do need the base stats to be able to accomplish their goal. This is a big reason why I don't love Rotom. Although Rotom Wash and Rotom Heat have great typing and move pools, their stats make them really difficult to use. Most of Rotom's stats are slightly above average, which makes it difficult to use in a specialist role. Lastly, Pokemon that are good enable the rest of the team in some way. This is most clear in support Pokemon like Incineroar or Dusclops, which allow their teammates extra breathing room. But it's true even of offensive Pokemon like Azumarill. Each battle is not 4 one-on-one battles. It's a 4 against 4, forcing your opponents to force down your offensive powerhouse, while your support Pokemon disrupts, using a high damage Pokemon to eliminate the threat to your defensive win condition, using a Pokemon that is disruptive to put your opponent out of the position before going into a Pokemon with high damage output. These are all good ways that Pokemon can bring out the best in their teammates. Aaron would say, before dividing into my personal definition, I want to quickly go over my personal philosophy regarding good Pokemon. I strongly believe that you can make any Pokemon work competitively. However, you have to work a lot harder to make certain Pokemon work, which can make the game a lot more challenging for you. My general principles for good Pokemon are as follows. The Pokemon generally matches up well versus most of the common Pokemon in the format. You can hit most of the Pokemon for neutral damage, you don't get OHKO'd by most of the common threats. The Pokemon commands pressure while it's out on the field, ideally with no setup required. They should see it can hit almost every Pokemon for at least neutral damage and doesn't need special control or an attack boosting move to deal lots of damage. Looking at it from the opposite side, here are some problems that I generally tend to see in Pokemon that I don't consider good. The Pokemon needs to use a setup move or item in order to deal substantial damage. The Pokemon needs to a certain field state, e.g. Weather, Trick Room, Tailwind, to succeed. The Pokemon does not match up well versus a significant number of common Pokemon in the meta. I generally don't feel like I have safe or consistent plays to make with a Pokemon, and feel like I constantly need to make hard predictions to gain an advantage with it. The Pokemon lacks good move coverage, resulting in relying on too many attacks of the same type. However, I think one thing that's really tough about Pokemon is that it's really hard to distinguish where your exact weaknesses are. It can be in team building, in team preview, making good predictions. I generally find that when you use good Pokemon, it's a bit easier to see where the holes in your game are. As a converse, when you use Pokemon that are not good, those Pokemon often directly contribute to making some of the game more difficult at every stage. I also think that there's a common misconception of good Pokemon are all common. That's not the case. Sage and Park won the 2014 World Championships with Pachirisu, which saw very little play throughout the season. I'd argue that Pachirisu fits under my definition of good. It just flew under the radar for most people that season since it saw so little usage. Thus, don't make the mistake of thinking any uncommon Pokemon is bad. There are plenty of other Pokemon sets like Pachirisu waiting to be discovered. There's no one truth to what makes a Pokemon good or worth using. We improve at this game by learning endlessly, especially from each other. Chances are that your principles are different from the person that you're talking to. Having a good discussion about your opinions with other people who are at a similar place in the Pokemon journey is, in my mind, the best way to improve at this game, and the best way to find the success that you seek. And now onto synergy. Synergy is a broad term used in team building to talk about how well your Pokemon work together. Specifically, how well do they cover for each other's weaknesses and enable each other's strengths? Because VGC battles are complex and dynamic, these symbiotic relationships can play out in many different ways. Here are a few quick examples of synergy. Weather Setter and Weather Steeper, Politoed and Kingdra. Politoed's drizzle sets up the ring for Kingdra's swim ability and water type attacks. It can further boost Kingdra's attacks and help with Helping Hand. Fake Out on Trick Room. Example, Incineroar and Dusclops. Using Fake Out causes one of your opponent's Pokemon to flinch, meaning an ally can use Trick Room more easily. Trick Room Setters and Slow Attackers, Sweepers. Trick Room and then allows other Slow Attackers to move first. Intimidate and Frail Partner, Landorus T and Raichu, and a Pokemon with Intimidate drops opponent's attack, meaning that ally Pokemon with lower physical defensive stats have more breathing room. Pokemon that slow the pace of the game down, and Pokemon that like to set up, Grimmsnarl on top of Feeny. One Pokemon slows your opponent's momentum by reducing their damage output, while the partner becomes gradually stronger. These Pokemon combinations play out in different ways, which demonstrates the scope of synergy effects on battle. Furthermore, as you can see, the synergy between Pokemon depends on what each contributing Pokemon is capable of. Typing, stats, moves, and abilities all affect how your team work together. The synergy between two or more Pokemon is roughly broken down to two main categories: offensive synergy and defensive synergy. Offensive synergy. How do these Pokemon complement each other offensively? Defensive synergy. How do these Pokemon complement each other defensively? These synergies are not binary. Different Pokemon combinations will have different amounts of offensive defensive synergy. Return to our example above. Politoed and Kingdra. Offensive synergy with a strong and fast rain boost attacks. However, Politoed and Kingdra don't really have a defensive synergy. Fake Out Trick Room. We wouldn't really classify them as a defensive synergy, although it allows the attack to go off, so this combination is synergistic to some extent. Trick Room Sledders. This is a purely offensive synergy. When Trick Room gets up, the slow attackers move first. Intimidate and Frail Partners. This is a defensive synergy. Intimidate allows the defensively weak partner to attack in situations where it must otherwise be threatened. Setup and slow down Pokemon. These Pokemon are often naturally defensive, and by working together, they can increase their defensive position while gradually threatening offense. Offensive and defensive synergy are ultimately defined by how the Pokemon work together towards your goal of winning the battle. Do these Pokemon work together by taking knockouts at a brisk pace, or by firing off strong attacks that opponents can't withstand? Or do they work together by tactically covering each other's bases, positioning, and grinding out the opponent until you reach a certain victory? In the rest of the article, we'll talk in more detail about offensive and defensive synergy, and discuss pitfalls and other contextual factors in team building. Offensive in Pokemon is all about moving before your opponent, dealing huge amounts of damage, and taking knockouts. Offensive synergy, then, is all about how your Pokemon work together to accomplish these goals. Here are a few ways that Pokemon can do that together. Complementary damage. Pokemon synergize offensively if they can threaten different subsets of the pool of available Pokemon with their damage output. If they can work together to take key knockouts or make switching difficult for your Pokemon, you'll have a great offensive position. Cover a weakness. If you like the pace that one Pokemon deals the damage at, add a Pokemon with a knockout is one of its central weaknesses to sit next to it. Overwhelming damage. The prior stages focus on attacking different areas of the type chart. On the other hand, it's possible to just achieve a high level of damage that the opposing Pokemon's types almost always don't matter. You'll knock them out regardless. Stacking modifiers such as boosts and helping hand are key to this sort of strategy. Offensive synergy is not about only attacking Offensive synergy is not only about the attacking power of the Pokemon you're using. They should use strong attacks that hits large swaths of available Pokemon for significant damage. But the pace at which these Pokemon attack, remember to knock out a Pokemon, you're going to have to either withstand an attack or move first. Speed and priority are important factors for offensive synergy as well. Offensive synergy is not the same as setup, which is a different strategy. For example, Dragapult Surf does not have offensive synergy with Colossal. It sets Colossal up, but has no other effect in battle. All of the damage is being dealt by Colossal in this case. Dragapult's Dragon Darts may synergize offensively with Colossal, and it can finish off Pokemon that Colossal might have barely missed knocking out, and deals damage boosted damage to Dragon-type Pokemon that might resist some Colossal's attacks. Offensive synergy is about how the Pokemon work together and to knock out threats. For defensive synergy, conversely, defensive synergy is all about achieving defensive goals to move you closer to victory. It's tricky to play defensively in Pokemon, especially VGC. It's harder to take damage and win than deal damage and win. Defensive play is about switching your Pokemon smartly, taking attacks, and navigating to positions where your opponent can't break your defenses. An important aspect of defensive play is switchability, or the ability of one of your Pokemon to switch in for another. Switchability is a factor of many attributes, but most importantly, typing and base stats. Two Pokemon are defensively synergistic, where they can switch out on attacks that would threaten each other without taking much damage. In double battles where you have two Pokemon on the field at a time, it's not enough to have great defensive stats or resist a Pokemon's attack. An opponent may just end up targeting your partner Pokemon. Some of your Pokemon may have abilities that boost your team's whole defenses or drop all of your opponent's offensive capabilities. Examples include Light Screen Reflect and the ability to Intimidate. Smart use of these tools can prevent your opponents from breaking through both of your Pokemon on the field, not just the user. Although Follow Me and Rage Powder are great defensive tools, we wouldn't call them defensive synergy. Amoonguss' Rage Powder does not have defensive synergy with Xerneas, but rather allows Xerneas to set up. Instead, Amoonguss has great defensive synergy with many Pokemon because of its grass poison typing. It can make use of that typing to switch in and threaten opponents with Spore. Anti-synergy is the term for when your Pokemon gets in the way of another one, and it's surprisingly common. Pokemon like type Tapu Fini have anti-synergy with Amoonguss. Amoonguss wants to use Spore to put foes to sleep, but Tapu Fini's Misty Surge prevents status conditions. Having multiple weather setters or terrain setters can be an example of anti-synergy. Prankster Pokemon or Pokemon that employ strong priority moves have anti-synergy with Psychic terrain setters, like Indeedee and Tapu Lele. Some anti-synergy is generally acceptable on a team, although not ideal, such as teams that use both Tapu Fini and Amoonguss. The type of synergies that you need, especially in reference to typing, vary depending on the metagame. There are certain formats where playing without a Steel-type Pokemon can make your life very difficult, and there are other formats where Steel typing is totally optional. There are formats where you don't want to make sure you're using as many different typings as possible, and other formats where traditional rules and assumptions about typing go out the window. But there's no blueprint for the types you need to bring when building, even if some types go better than others. If you aren't sure which synergies to start with, take a look at some of the teams that are performing well in the current format. Pay attention to, Pay attention to how many teams share common types. For example, do most teams have a Steel-type Pokemon? Are there common pairings yet beyond just the individual usage stats? Or does anything else jump out at you? Is Intimidate on every team? Does every team have Taunt? As you become more comfortable with the game, you'll be able to form your own interferences about what is needed in a format. This may seem like a lot of information, but the short version is, you want to make sure that the Pokemon on your team work well together, and at the very least, don't get in the way of one another. I will be 1 minute. Okay, we're back. A core is a group of Pokemon that synergize so well that their synergy is the defining factor of how your team plays. The Pokemon in a core often aid each other both offensively in different parts of the type chart for super effective, working together to take KOs, and defensively, switching in on super effective threatening attacks for each other. Really, a core is simply a natural extension of the synergy that you'll build into your team at the beginning of the team building process. Defining a core is practically useful to think about during team building, because once you have established a core, it can provide direction for your team, and you can base your remaining Pokemon slots on supporting its strength and covering its weaknesses. How do I make a core? If you already have an idea for the start of your team, the core of your team is going to be the Pokemon that support it and bring it closer to being battle ready. We have a guide to making cores in step 2 of our team building guide. Class cores. Many cores are specifically used with the format they are created in, and may be less useful in other formats because they are taken out of context. However, a few cores have classically cropped up across many formats, and they are worth paying attention to. Fire, Water, Grass core. Although you may think that of all the Route 1 choices between the starter Pokemon, Fire, Water type, and Grass type, all have resist attacks, but would otherwise hit each other for super effective damage. These cores usually lend themselves well to bulky offense, because each Pokemon has to be able to switch in and take an attack to make full use of their naturally defensive synergy. There are usually standout Fire, Water, and Grass type Pokemon in any given format, and it's easy to pair them together on a team that's focused on switching and positioning Pokemon carefully. Dragon, Fairy, Steel core. Dragon type, Fairy type, and Steel Pokemon all have their useful defenses and offensive typing, and it turns out their defensive synergy pairs quite nicely. Furthermore, Pokemon of these types tend to have high base stat totals, so they synergize well together. A mode can refer to a mode of team building or during battling. Team building modes. A team building mode can refer to 2, sometimes 3 Pokemon that work together in a way that the rest of your team doesn't. 2 Pokemon that are often led together, Politoed and Kingdra are team's raid mode. 2 Pokemon that work well together but are kind of disjointed from the rest of the team. And DD Female and Hatterene can be a faster team's Trick Room mode. Modes operate differently than your other team cores will. When a few Pokemon on your team's core works around them and highlights their strength, Pokemon in a mode stick out. Often they work together explicitly and might not work as harmoniously with the rest of your team. This doesn't make them bad choices. Often modes are quite powerful, but sometimes they might work together awkwardly with the rest of your team. And you might be constricted on which Pokemon you can lead, which you can bring in the back, and which you can take to battle together. When should I add a mode to our team? If you have a core of 3 or 4 Pokemon that work well together, a mode might add some depth and variability, because you can do one of 4 things. Play your core the way you originally intended it. Lead to your mode, finish off with your core Pokemon in the back. Lead with core Pokemon, and bring your mode Pokemon in the back for momentum shift on switches. Flexibility to integrate into your core's play. Mix core and mode Pokemon in the front and the back. However, you should be careful with modes. Modes can restrict your options during team preview. For instance, if you have a Trick Room mode on your team, pouring onto an Escavalier, and you have a Pokemon that only works in Trick Room, Escavalier, you're always going to have to bring it with your Trick Room setter, or hope that your opponent sets up Trick Room for you. This can make your team feel like it doesn't mesh together very well. Pokemon sometimes give you fewer options for picking lead and back Pokemon. For instance, if 2 Pokemon need to come next to each other, you're only going to be able to lead them or bring them in the back next to each other. This also reduces flexibility. When your team only has few lead options, at best your opponent will respect your mode and make a game plan for it, or at worst, you might telegraph all of your viable leads to your opponent from team preview. A battling mode is a set of Pokemon on your team that form a game plan that you can reuse in a lot of different battling scenarios. Coming up with these modes can save you time during the team preview stages of the game. Similarly to cores, battling modes are all about how your Pokemon synergize together. The difference here is practical. Core refers to the Pokemon that synergy in the abstract based based on your work during the Theoremon stage. And battling modes are about what you can actually intend to bring to games. How does that game plan actually work out? How do I find battling modes on my team? Unlike team building mode, which is an intentional choice in team building, battling modes are often, not always, found in practice. Some of the questions you can ask yourself to figure out what the modes are on your team include: do I find myself always feeling like I need a house of the same 4 Pokemon in certain matchups? Are there any Pokemon on my team that I found work especially well alongside each other in battle? Are there Pokemon on my team that feel like they need another team member or can't be used well? After picking my leads, do I know which 2 Pokemon would work best in the back? Wrapping up, distinctions like cores, team building, and battling modes are often useful conceptual tools to think about the Pokemon your team synergize. You don't need any of them, and if you don't end up thinking about the game this way, that's totally okay. These terms can broadly capture the different relationships that Pokemon on your team have with each other, and they can simply be useful when you're diagnosing an issue on your team. Is your core solid? Do you have a mode or 2, even 2 or 3, and does it mesh well with the rest of your team? Thinking in these ways can lead to a deeper and more fluid understanding of your team. Archetypes. Sometimes a strong core will become popular and people will iterate on it and optimize for partners that minimize its weakness. At this point, many players will have similar teams built around the same Pokemon and goals, and those teams will likely succeed at the variety of events and tournaments, although they are rarely exactly alike. At this point, we refer to this core as archetype. Typically, archetype just refers to a core with defined strengths and weaknesses that really defines a team and isn't just a backbone or glue Pokemon. This is because all of these teams within an archetype will have similar goals and typically play in similar ways. Pay attention to archetypes. As the metagame for a format develops, many archetypes are becoming too popular to ignore, and you'll see them frequently in both ladder and tournament battles. At the beginning of a format, many archetypes will be established, and players are experimenting and iterating on their best ideas. As the metagame goes on, a metagame will form around these archetypes. The metagame is decentralized, the archetypes will become more varied. The metagame is centralized, there will be fewer archetypes, but they will be very well optimized and challenging to defeat. That being said, not every team will lie within a known archetype, and while it's good to have a rough idea of how the archetype works, they aren't a complete snapshot of the format. Don't feel like you have to start with an archetype when you're building your own team. The best place to look is tournament results, for two reasons. First, the teams there have proven success because they placed highly in the tournament. Second, players will tend to take tournaments seriously, so you can learn about what other players think is their best shot of winning by looking at what they bring to events. Check out Victory Road for recent tournament results, which we will do later. How should I think about archetypes when team building? During the team building, you want to consider the very popular archetypes, maybe making a threat list. That's smart. Hey, hold on. Oh, never mind, my bad. But I will do this. We'll make a threat list. And how your team handles them. This will provide constraint because it will quickly become apparent, either in theory or in practice, which archetypes your team struggles against, and then you might have to edit your team. Many archetypes that gain popularity are quite strong. Good answers to popular archetypes may be rather hard to find, and usually aren't as easy as finding one perfect Pokemon that matches up perfectly. Working to find team building solutions to popular cores is perhaps the most challenging and rewarding part of VGC. If a particular archetype interests you when you're building your own team, the strengths will be well known, which will give you ideas and maybe even a starting point for your team. However, the weakness of that archetype will also be well known, and it's fun to try to solve those problems yourself. If this path interests you, we strongly recommend working through the archetypes as if you were building it from scratch yourself, and not slapping on any Pokemon or taking anything for granted. Why is each Pokemon added? What's necessary, and what can be optimized? This will not only give you a better understanding of how your team plays out, but maybe you'll find a cool new direction for the team that others may have overlooked. As players learn and grow in the format, they'll begin to understand what Pokemon work extremely well together, and make teams based around the combination's fundamental goals. These archetypes often define the metagame, and they will wax and wane in popularity as time in the format goes on. You don't have to use core from an archetype, or treat the current archetypes as some sort of unwavering standard. But understanding which archetype is meant to do lets you put into the current metagame in concrete terms. From there, even though team building itself might not be any easier, it will be well defined and you'll understand your team and its performance much better. For consistency, this is something I struggle with. What is consistency? Pokemon is a game that in every way contains variation. Your opponent's knowledge and tendencies vary. The Pokemon on your opponent's team varies. If given the same situation 2 different times, an opponent may make 2 different choices. Your luck will vary from day to day. Consistency then is about finding victory no matter what variations stand in your way. Consistency can be searched for in any aspect of Pokemon. Consistency in team building, consistency in strategy, consistency in play. Consistency is very challenging to achieve and is more of an ideal than a reality in most cases. However, consistency is a useful goal to be in search of, and chasing it will help you form good habits in both team building and battling. We'll define what consistency means to us and how we approach it ourselves. You will win more games by reducing variance in general, and you can reduce the amount of variance in your battles at the team building step. We expand on this idea more generally in this article. If you can use a move on your team to stop an opponent's setups, gimmicks, or hijinks in general, we'd say that move is consistent. No matter what your opponent is trying to do, you have tools to stop it and stop it cold in its tracks. These moves reduce your opponent's options. We're talking about moves like Fake Out, Taunt, Haze, and Safeguard. Not every utility moves work consistently though. Lucky Chant only helps you in a small margin of gains. Roar always moves last and is reactive. If your opponent uses a damaging move, you might end up taking damage and giving them a free switch. The strategy is consistent if it can be executed no matter what your opponent is, what knowledge they have about the game, or how thoroughly they are familiar with your team. Maybe they've even played against it a few minutes ago. There are, of course, many strong opponents out there, but there are also plenty of strong Pokemon, and even the toughest of opponents will have to tread lightly against them or risk defeat. A consistent strategy is in the direct opposition to a gimmick, which is a strategy that cheekily attempts to take advantage of an opponent's lack of knowledge or preparation. Gimmicks are fun to use, but they may not be optimal for a best of 3 play or a long tournament versus strong opponents, and we aren't well versed in use. A strategy stops being a gimmick when it works well regardless of your opponent's knowledge. When I review to other people's teams, one of the first things I do is try to attempt to get a handle on how consistent their strategy is. Here are some questions though that you can guide yourself through a process. Remember again that consistency isn't a binary, and it is often an ideal rather than an achievable goal. So don't be too hard on yourself if you can't answer all of the questions positively. Consistency checklist. Theory modeling. Does the process behind the decisions make sense to me? Does the thought process behind the decision make sense to my friends? Ladder play. Can I consistently beat people on the ladder with my team? More so or less so than I can with other teams I built? How common are the Pokemon that my team building choices shine against? How common will they be at the tournament I compete in? Are there other... Okay. Sorry. We are going to go to this. We're saving this for later, actually. However, for the moment, I'm not reading through that. Because we haven't gone to building team yet. Should also send this too. Okay. Consistently in play. Consistency in play is about reducing variance during a battle on your path to win. In team preview, can you find a lead that works against your opponent's strategy, no matter what they lead? In battle, can you avoid relying on luck? For example, if you need to hit a sleep powder or lose the game, can you find another path throughout the battle? If during any given turn, can you find a move that works no matter what your opponent does? If you're trying to close out a game, can you find a path to win 100% of the time or as close as possible? At times, it can feel like a Pokemon game can come down to random chance, and losing in those scenarios can be discouraging. Luck is a part of Pokemon that we can't ignore. However, by giving luck its due and focusing on reducing variance on every stage of the game, you're minimizing the impact that luck will have on your performance. That's not to say that consistency is at all easy to achieve. In fact, searching for consistency is probably one of the toughest perspectives with which to approach the game. Many people can win a game in its final turns 90% of the time, but it takes a great deal of knowledge and foresight to navigate endgames where you win 99% of the time or 100% of the time. We spend a good deal of our lives in pursuit of this kind of excellence. When you're analyzing your performance, no matter how the battle went, you'll nearly always find a better way that you could have approached it from a viewpoint of consistency. In a way, hunting for consistency is a method of imposing control on the uncontrollable. That's the part of Pokemon that we love about competitive. Your team determines your luck. How lucky or unlucky you are in Pokemon is determined a lot more than your karma and random variance. There's a lot that goes into whether a player is lucky or not, much of which is within a player's control. While the concept might not be easy to understand in theory, it is difficult to internalize, even for the most advanced players. This article will cover the team building part of improving your luck. Taking control of odds. There's a lot of potential variance in Pokemon. Critical hits, secondary effects, damaging rolls, and accuracy are just some of the ways that you can make predicting the outcome of a turn difficult. However, there are certain things that you can do as team builder to nudge the game in favor for you to. However, there are certain things you can do as a team builder to nudge the game to favor you more or punish you less. For example, you could select more accurate moves instead of less accurate moves. To be more direct, a player who prioritizes accurate moves in the team building process is far less likely to lose games due to missing a move than a player who does not. This isn't to say accuracy is the end-all be-all of team building. Sometimes you need to run an inaccurate move to bring out the maximum value in a Pokemon. That being said, whenever you choose to use a move that is not guaranteed to hit, you should be thinking about whether you are likely to have alternatives, such as Dragon Pulse, a Draco Meteor on the same Pokemon, as well as the scenarios where you'll be forced to rely on the move. Moving consistently after your opponent, having a team with poor speed control, is implicitly risky. By moving after your opponent, you're risking critical hits and secondary effects, Scald Burn, Thunder Para, Muddy Water accuracy drops, etc. That might be prevented by attacking first. One of the best ways to ensure you avoid negative RNG is to knock out your opponent's Pokemon before it can activate, or before it can attack. After all, fainted Pokemon can't crit or flinch you. Set up opportunities for your opponent to move first. Focus on speed control, fast Pokemon, like the item Choice Scarf, or moves such as Tailwind, Icy Wind, and Trick Room. Pay attention to team composition. Certain playstyles can be more susceptible to poor luck. If a team is very fast and frail, a single bit of bad luck can cause a domino effect that can cost the whole game. However, a team that is too defensive can lose too much offensive presence by a surprise knockout or status effect. Additionally, a team that is stretched too thin and relies too heavily on any one Pokemon for specific matchups is susceptible to losing games due to a single bit of bad luck. Accuracy, speed, and playstyle are just 3 examples of many that influence whether luck will favor you on any given day. It is a mistake to think that just because we are all playing the same game, we therefore should all have more or less the same luck. Certain players really are luckier or unluckier than others, not because they were born with something, but because of the decisions they were made. The good news is, if you consider yourself to be unlucky when it comes to Pokemon, it's likely because you are making decisions that make you vulnerable to luck. As a student of the game, you should be more constantly assessing which of your decisions give you the opportunity for good luck, and which makes you vulnerable to bad luck. By paying attention and learning to identify decisions that improve your odds, you can change your luck for the better. When you're building a team, one of the decisions you have to make is which moves you're going to give each Pokemon. Each Pokemon gets 4 moves total, for a total of 24 across the team, and these moves are quite important as they will be your primary way of playing the game. So how do you know which moves are best to use? 2 of the factors which influencing which moves you choose are move power and accuracy. These aren't mutually exclusive, and a move can be both powerful and accurate. However, most moves with high base power, in general above 95, have drawbacks, and many of those drawbacks come in the form of decreased accuracy. Some examples include Thunderbolt vs Thunder, Flamethrower vs Fire Blast, Scald vs Hydro Pump. These moves are grouped together because they share a similar distribution, meaning the Pokemon that can learn the higher accuracy, safer move can also learn the less accurate and thus less riskier move. So how do you know which moves to choose for each Pokemon? There are a couple of philosophies when it comes to answering that question. Some players will tell you it depends on the damage calculations around the move. If Fire Blast or Hydro Pump are necessary to pick up a knockout, then they are the right choice. Other players might argue that the higher base power move is better in general, or the higher accuracy move is better in general. There isn't one right or wrong answer, and if there were, it would heavily depend on the context. But for now, I'll tell you what I do. I personally recommend setting an accuracy threshold, a minimum accuracy you're not willing to go below. Some players are comfortable using low accuracy move. I personally have a soft threshold at 90% accuracy. I don't even like using moves that are 90% accurate, but I'll use them begrudgingly, and I try never to go below that. Obviously, with any rule, there are exceptions. I will often use Will-O-Wisp despite its accuracy only being 85%. These personal rules are things you should experiment with, and they may grow or change over time. They should be a loose set of guidelines that serve as a baseline when making a decision about a team. Some common reasons to dip below accuracy threshold include when a Pokemon has a more accurate move version already, such as Draco Meteor and Dragon Pulse on the same Pokemon. If there's no real substitute for a move, or the substitute is significantly worse, such as Groudon's Precipitate or the Rock Slide move in general. If you have a way of making a move more accurate, such as Gravity plus Hypnosis, or Dynamax with inaccurate moves in Generation 8. If you're a high-risk, high-reward player who's comfortable losing games due to missing move, with the trade-off being of more powerful when you hit, I don't personally recommend this. When your move isn't often a move you rely on to win, and it can offer a big advantage when it lands, such as Sleep Powder or to a lesser extent Will-O-Wisp. One reason I only use very accurate moves is because of how inaccuracy plays across the tournament. In a tournament, you can play upward of 30 games. And when you make a conservative estimate that you're using your 90 accuracy move once per game, hitting that move is a make or break and can easily lose you 3 games or more over the course of a tournament due to your inaccuracy. Of course, the more inaccurate moves you run, the higher odds are of losing in a tournament due to missing. And as you're never sure when your moves will miss in preparation, it's my best opinion to optimize it to minimize the risk in advance. Despite my tirade against inaccuracy, there are some circumstances where a Pokemon has no other choice than to use a move that is inaccurate, primarily due to there being no good substitutes for the move on a certain Pokemon. Ideally, I personally prefer to avoid these Pokemon, but there are sometimes they are the best fit for a team. In using these Pokemon, you should understand that you are accepting some additional and inherent risk and should try to bake in some stability when possible, such as not clicking the inaccuracy move unless they are necessary, or adding inaccurate moves as they are more consistent in the long run. The trade-off between move power and move accuracy is just one of many things to consider when building the team. Though the choices you make will resonate through your games, don't be afraid to experiment with different moves and to learn what you are personally comfortable with. Only have 2 left in this section, and then we are going to move on to the very last couple sections. Putting it all together and pitfalls. But these ones are generally shorter. So I'm going to take another break after we finish Abstract, and then I'll come back and we'll finish both of these at the same time. Straight from putting it all together to pitfalls. Hidden information in Pokemon. Information. How much you know about your opponent's team can play a major part in Pokemon battle. In other multiplayer games like fighting games and chess, you know what options your opponent has at all times. These games are perfect information games. In contrast, Pokemon is an imperfect information game, in which you don't know every option available to your opponent. In Pokemon, you can only know for sure what tools your opponent has to access after they have already revealed them. Each Pokemon has multiple traits that can be altered depending on players' decisions. Moves, items, nature, and EV spreads are all customizable facets of the game. Importantly, these elements are not visible in Team Preview. You won't know what your opponent chose to do until you find out during the game. Making a plan to defeat your opponent is dependent on knowing or assuming what decisions your opponent has made. Even decisions that may appear minor, unorthodox move or item, or an unusual speed stat, can have a large implication in the way that the match is played. This is one of the reasons why Game 2 or 3 in a best of 3 set will often play out differently than Game 1. The players have gotten additional information on their opponent's team, and also how their teams interact, and will often adjust midway through a set. What leads into competitive Pokemon is an interesting trade-off between consistency and surprise factor. How influential your choices are when they are revealed to your opponent. Surprise factor is a blanket term or to talk about unorthodox options in Pokemon. As players figure out what is strong within a format, standardization occurs, and by deviating from that, you can catch people off guard. This can be as simple as switching around the way a Pokemon is trained, for example, going faster on a support Pokemon than expected. Other options include running an unusual move or item on one of your Pokemon, or even running a Pokemon that isn't popular in order to catch your opponents off guard. You can also use Pokemon in tandem in surprising ways. 2 priority moves or a surprise boost to help your partner pick up a surprise KO are some examples of combinations that can quickly swing the match. When considering how heavily you weigh your surprise factor, you should always consider the type of tournament you're playing in. Typically, unorthodox options perform better when fewer games are going to be played. Some players consider best of one, where the set is over after a single game, to be gimmicky, as players are rewarded for winning games without options that are difficult to predict. Conversely, teams that don't rely on surprise factor will perform well in a 2 or 3 day best of 3 tournament. Here are some direct examples of what we described above. Switching around the way a Pokemon is trained. Running an unusual move. Running an unexpected Pokemon. Or best of 1 oriented strategies. You might be wondering what surprise factor actually looks like in a tournament. Let's take a look at 2 examples. Wolflake vs James Beck, Wolflake vs Brandon Meckley. We can come back to that at another time. What's the balance? It's worth noting that consistency and surprise factor aren't mutually exclusive. In my opinion, some of the strongest Pokemon are the tools that are difficult to prepare for if you're caught unaware and are still strong after they've been revealed. There's a difference between making a choice in team building that is unorthodox, but you expect to be strong, rather than picking an option because it is surprisingly unorthodox. For players who are new to the game, I wouldn't spend too much time worrying about this concept. You need to learn first what is standard before you can deviate from it. For players who have a good grasp of what is popular and who are considering making the choices in order to catch their opponents off guard, here are just a few things to consider. Is the tournament best of 1 or best of 3? How useful is my choice once my opponent knows about it? What is my goal for this tournament? What is the opportunity cost of choosing to deviate from the norm? How long is the tournament? Some common pitfalls. There are several pitfalls to focus on in surprise factor as a main strategy. First and foremost, many players know what each Pokemon is capable of. Players commonly scour Pokemon's information pages trying to find a hidden edge or tactic that makes a Pokemon better, even if those same players roll up to a tournament using a completely standard team. Try not to rely on your opponent's lack of Pokemon universe knowledge. Second, in a best of 3 setting, your opponent will be able to adapt once the initial shock has worn off. You may need to rely on other aspects of your team, or have multiple surprises in store for your opponent. Lastly, your opponent may be able to actually infer some of your surprises. For example, if during a team preview, they threaten a Trick Room team setup, and you lead a seemingly unassuming Pokemon into their Trick Room center lead, they may hedge that you have some sort of move or hidden tactic on it that will disrupt their strategy. Naturally, any tournament with open sheets that will have drastically fewer options for surprises. Open team sheets typically include everything about a Pokemon except for their IVs, EVs, and natures, which will end up being the only opportunities for surprises. Adding options focused on surprise factor is a stylistic choice that differs from team builder to team builder. Catching opponents off guard is definitely something to consider when building a team, but surprise shouldn't be the primary driving force when starting. When I build my teams, I focus on building strong Pokemon that I believe in, and if those Pokemon happen to do something out of the ordinary, all the better. And last, for the abstract ideas, we have the metagame. One of the most common terms when talking about competitive Pokemon is, what is the metagame? Technically speaking, metagame simply means game within a game, which I know wasn't especially helpful for me when I first started playing. So functionally, what is the metagame and why do we care? The rules dictate which a Pokemon can or cannot be used, and these rules change at least once a year. This is called a format or rule set. The amount of Pokemon that are legal widely vary. Some years barely over 100 species of Pokemon are legal, and some years it's closer to 1,000. However, regardless of the number of Pokemon legal, the distribution of their use isn't going to be even. There's no rule set where you're going to see Metapod with high usage. Not all Pokemon are created equally, and as such, not all Pokemon are used equally. Metagame is the term to describe which Pokemon are popular and which aren't. If you're new to VGC, you might have balked at the idea of learning nearly 1,000 Pokemon in order to play the game competitively. However, functionally speaking, you can probably win tournaments while only knowing the top 50 or so. In some cases, even less. The metagame is specific to whatever context you'll be battling in. If you're playing on the latter, the metagame's context is going to be very general. And when you're going to see a lot of popular Pokemon, if you're going to your weekly tournament or playing versus one of your close friends, there's still a metagame. The metagame is whatever Pokemon are popular there. When we talk about metagames, we're discussing how concept broadly, which roughly describes what Pokemon in general are getting used right now. But it's important to think about whether there's more specific contextual metagame than the team you're making will battle in. Excuse me. It's worth noting that the metagame concept is not something concrete. A metagame is practically useful to you because it describes which Pokemon you're likely to play against. A metagame is more than just raw usage statistics or popular teams. Rather, it loosely encapsulates which Pokemon combinations, or teams people currently view as favorable. There's never one right answer about what the metagame is at any moment in time. In this article, we'll define what metagame means to us and how we can keep track of how a metagame grows over time. Why should I care about the metagame? The metagame is incredibly relevant to consider when building a team, no matter who you are. You cannot give yourself the tools to beat your opponent without first considering what your opponents are going to be using. Each opponent on team has a weakness, and deciding which weakness you are unlikely to play against and which ones need to be absolutely accounted for is a skill in team building that you can take very far. Importantly, metagames merely describe what your opponents are likely to bring. Some people treat metagame as a user manual for building their own team, but that is entirely team builder's decision. It is not necessary to build your team around the elements that you recognize in the known metagame. But if you want to succeed in games, you must understand and respect the threats that you identify as part of it. The metagame influences how we think about the game. When building a team, it's important to consider matchups. If a Pokemon matches up well into the metagame, it does well against popular Pokemon or teams. As simple water types are extremely popular, I might say that grass type Pokemon like Rillaboom has a good matchup versus the metagame. If the top Pokemon are all physical attackers, I might prioritize means of reducing attacks, such as the ability to intimidate or moves like Will-O-Wisp or Reflect. That being said, the Pokemon at the top of the metagame are often useful in many scenarios, and encountering them might not be as simple as taking advantage of the type chart. The metagame may also shift. This refers to a rebalancing of popularity of Pokemon, or teams, or archetypes. For example, I see that rain teams are picking up in usage. I say that rain teams are a more important part of the meta. And then I'd have to think more carefully about them than when I'm making my own team. If you ever use a team that a streamer used or that a team won a tournament with and found less success than the original user had, it may be because of shifts in the metagame. The metagame could shift over time, or because of the success or popularity of a specific team. Maybe even like the one you're using. What does the metagame shift actually look like? All it means for the metagame to shift is that the common perception of which Pokemon are strong has changed. This often happens after a big tournament performances, but it can also happen under the other circumstances as well. When a metagame shifts, Pokemon rise and fall in popularity. Dramatic changes mean that the players will find themselves in new contexts. Strategies that were useful before may not have great tools for managing the new landscape. How do you learn the new metagame? In my opinion, it's best to be aware but not bound to the metagame. It provides direction in team building and threats to prepare for. But if you only use what's popular, you might miss some hidden gems. As mentioned, it can be misleading at times. That being said, there are some things you can do to get a sense of what the metagame is at. Play games and take note of when you're playing against often. Sorry. Are there Pokemon that are more popular than you expected? Are there Pokemon that you expected to see that are not present or less common? Check the usage statistics. You can use websites like Peakalytics to see what is currently popular. Keep in mind usage stats are an approximation, so they don't often tell the full story. Watch people play. Streamers and YouTubers can be great to watch to learn the game as well as to see what is popular at their rating. Check out recent tournaments. Tournaments are often the biggest contributor to which Pokemon are popular at the current moment, and collaborate with other people. Compare your notes and learn from each other to better understand the metagame. Don't feel like you need to be up to date 100% with the metagame at all times, even if you're trying to take the game very seriously. Keeping up with the metagame can be like drinking from a fire hose, and there's a lot to learn. If you have a rough and general idea of what the metagame functions, that's going to be good enough for team building. The metagame is important because the real way to evaluate whether a team is going to be strong or weak is to know which Pokemon is going to be up against in battle. Whether you play versus a friend on the ladder or the tournament, a metagame does not have to be a blueprint for which Pokemon must be used to find success. Although it is certainly possible to build with that perspective, metagames practically are a descriptive tool that lets us make educated guesses into what the goals of our team need to be when fighting against other trainers. Without knowledge of a metagame, a team builder plays no respect to the context that they'll battle in. And in Pokemon, context is everything. And on that note, we're going to be getting over to here, putting it all together in pitfalls. We're not going to be worried about getting ready for battles. We're just going to be focused on these. And then lastly, pitfalls after these guides. But in the meantime, I'm going to be taking another little break. I'll be right back. Okay. Time to finish. So we have to go through the pitfalls and then no, sorry, not pitfalls. Putting it all together and then the pitfalls and then we're done. And then, I think I'll either finally start team building or I'll take another break and then go team building. So, how to put it all together. So far, we've told you some pretty general ideas of team building. We've talked about some of the qualities of the Pokemon we look for when we're building a team, how they might work together, and the moves and strategies that we might prioritize. However, at this point you might be wondering, how do I build a team myself? In this portion of the guide, we'll show you the process that we follow to build a team from start to finish. We hope that these steps can guide you to assemble your own team. Here we'll explain our fundamental goals in a rough template that can be applied to any format. Know that the team building process is pretty abstract, and you and I might not take the same path from an idea to a completed team. Furthermore, there's no one right or wrong way to build a team. Generally, Pokemon are numbered in order that they are put into a team. So for example, if I focus my team around Pikachu, Pikachu will be added first. It's my first slot. You should loosely keep this ordering in mind. It's not important in the long run, but if you want to talk about your team with other players, hearing about the ordering can help them follow your thought process when building. Every team begins with an idea. Maybe the idea that you have is to use a particular Pokemon or combination of Pokemon. Maybe it's to use a particular move or tactic in a certain way. If you're starting from a certain Pokemon or combination of Pokemon, put that Pokemon/those Pokemon on your team in the team builder. You don't have to do anything else. Maybe sketch out some rough EVs for them, or think about what moves or items you'd like to use first. If you're starting from a particular tactic, such as a move, what Pokemon are going to carry out this tactic on your team? Start there. Pick the most pivotal Pokemon or combination of Pokemon, and put it/them on your team. What we're beginning to do in this step is forming the core, the key idea or goal of your team. We haven't added anything to that core yet other than its foundation. We've gotten the main idea, but it isn't complete yet. Remember, you'll be bringing 4 of your 6 Pokemon to every battle. So if you just started with 1 Pokemon in step 1, you've got a ways to go before you can even test your team. At this point, our mission is to add Pokemon to aid the main goal of the team. When adding Pokemon in this step, you should loosely outline how they will fit your team. There's no need to fill out a complete EV spread or settle on a move or item yet. Generally, you'll add Pokemon in this step for one of these reasons. Complementary offense. This Pokemon synergizes with the offensive capabilities of your core with its own offensive power. Note that the complementary offense isn't limited to the type chart. Speed priority attacks or spread moves are also great offensive reasons to pick a Pokemon. One heavy pitfall at this step is to only add Pokemon that are purely offensive in nature. This can lead you towards a hyper-offensive team. Unless you're explicitly trying to play this aggressive playstyle, try to pick a Pokemon that has a range of offensive and defensive capabilities. Complementary defensive values. If you value switching Pokemon around often, you might want to add a Pokemon with synergistic defensive type to your core. Just like offensive synergies, defensive synergy isn't limited to a type chart. Abilities such as Intimidate or good defensive base stats can allow for Pokemon to switch in even without resistance. As a word of caution, defensive capability isn't everything in VGC. Make sure you know what these Pokemon are adding to your team. Does your Pokemon from step 1 benefit from Tailwind, Trick Room, Fake Out, Follow Me, or any other supportive tactic? These type of moves may enable your main Pokemon to accomplish their goals in battle. Be careful with purely supportive Pokemon as they can skew the offensive capabilities of your team. Make sure the Pokemon you're adding still exert pressure onto your opponent. Every Pokemon on my team has to do damage with at least 1 move. That way, if ever my last Pokemon is standing, it has a chance to win the game for me. As a rule, in this step, I try to add Pokemon to further my team's main strength, rather than to counter any one strategy in particular. It's too early to add Pokemon specifically to counter other strategies. We're still forming the main goal of our team. It's okay to add Pokemon that are good against other strategies, but that should be a side benefit to the main reason why the Pokemon belongs. I'm making this distinction because it's an easy trap to be nervous about the strong teams that you'll face. But if you keep picking Pokemon to counter different strategies, your team will lack cohesion and focus. We'll make this consideration in the next step. Typically, I try to have a starting point that I think will be strong against other teams that are popular naturally. By ensuring that your main mode has the ground it needs, you'll hopefully already have given yourselves tools against certain matchups. Repeat this process a few times. You want to have 3 to 5 Pokemon on your team before ending this step. The goal at this point is to finish the main goal or end idea of your team. Step 2, Part B. How do you know when your main idea is finished? When we follow this part of the process, we want to feel like our team is near the point where we could battle with it, that we filled out all the details. We want to feel good about what we've done and feel like it's an appropriate time to take what we've made and go test our main idea. We don't expect what we have to be perfect at this point, but we want to know if the ideas that we've built the team on are actually going to hold up when we finish and start using them. There's no right or wrong way to decide when the core of your team is done. Everyone has their own sense of when a core feels complete. For our process, here's how we can describe it best. You don't feel anything is missing from your team's core. You feel like you've covered the majority of your weaknesses, or the major parts of your weaknesses. You can sort of imagine how battles will go. You can feel like the idea that you started with is fleshed out enough that you can use it. Once you have your core Pokemon in your builder, imagine some of the different teams or Pokemon you expect to face. Try to think about which Pokemon on your team you'd want to bring versus those teams, and which you'd likely leave behind. If you don't like the situations that you imagine, you may have to go back to the drawing board on some of your Pokemon. When you do this, you're adding your Theorymon skills. Step 3, round out the team. By this step, you'll have finished your core. Congratulations, you're done with the main part of the team. At this point, you probably won't and shouldn't have 6 Pokemon on your team. Sorry, 1 second. Now is the time to consider other teams and Pokemon. Every core has its weaknesses, and yours is not an exception. It's good to be upfront with yourself about what the weak spots of your team are, so that you can adjust for them during battle. Are there popular Pokemon moves that tear a hole in your strategy? Is there a popular team or a core with a good matchup against your main strategy? Are there any big weaknesses in your team? Excuse me. You may not have answers to these questions until after you test. That's okay. Regardless of this step, you have 3 options. What Pokemon or teams did you identify to be difficult matches for yourself? Add strong Pokemon to your team that are particularly useful against what you've identified to be an issue. Ideally, the strengths of the Pokemon that you add at this stage won't overlap with what your core already is good at. You can think of this as adding breadth to your team, widening the scope of what your team can handle. Add Pokemon that interact with the Pokemon in your core in interesting and new ways. This may give you more than one mode in your core. You'll be able to choose how Pokemon are going to interact with each other depending on a game and opponent. This is a great place to add Pokemon with, You can think of this, Add Pokemon that interact with the Pokemon in your core in new and interesting ways. This might give you more than one mode in your core. You'll be able to choose how your Pokemon are going to interact with each other depending on the game and the opponent. And this is a great place to add Pokemon with useful utility moves. This gives your team depth. Add Pokemon that take your team in a whole new direction. For example, if your team is faster paced, your last 2 Pokemon could set and work well in Trick Room. Or if you have a team focused in Trick Room, your last 2 Pokemon could work well outside of its effects. This process is called adding a mode. The Pokemon you add should complement each other, and you should have some reason that they'll work alongside the rest of your team. You'll probably need the last 2 Pokemon slots to add a mode. Follow the guideline above. You'll have 6 Pokemon in your builder block or box. If you hit a wall, don't be afraid to unwind and some of your work and return to an earlier step with a different Pokemon. For step 4, finish the details. At this step, you should know all of the 6 Pokemon that are going to be on your team, and you should have imagined some ways that you'd like to battle using them. Now is the time to fill in every aspect you skimmed over in the earlier steps. EVs, moves, items, etc. Once you're done with step 4, the first draft of your team is complete. Congratulations! Building a team from scratch is not easy. The first draft of your team is unlikely to be the final draft of your team. Throughout this template, you've imagined different scenarios where you'll find this. You've imagined different scenarios you'll find yourself in when you use this team during battle. The only way to know how right you are is to practice and evaluate your guesses. You may find yourself returning to the drawing board on some or all of the team. There are no hard and fast rules when you iterate on a team. If you thought a Pokemon that you added earlier was essential but isn't working out, don't be afraid to move on. You might find yourself struggling with one slot in particular on your team. Maybe you love your core Pokemon, but you can't find the last Pokemon to make it work. This is a common issue that we call 6 Pokemon syndrome, and you can read about it here. At the end of the day, if you love your team, great. If you try to find try a few things that they don't work and you don't like what you came up with, it's okay to scrap them and try again. Team building is a muscle, and the more you work on it, the easier it'll get, and the more likely you'll like the teams you build. A common theme so far is that there's no right or wrong way to play Pokemon competitively. Even at the highest levels, competitors are motivated by a variety of different factors. There are players present throughout all levels of competitive Pokemon to varying degrees that are motivated by something else. Instead of using commonly used Pokemon, they prefer winning in a way that feels right to them. Sometimes these players are even willing to use Pokemon perceived as weaker in pursuit of this goal. Most often this takes the form of winning with your favorites, which is a term used in conjunction with players who build their team around a Pokemon not necessarily because of what it offers competitively, but instead due to some kind of personal attachment. In this article, I'll share some of my tools that help me identify the strengths of any Pokemon and how I build a team around them. I should be upfront. First, starting a team simply by choosing a Pokemon you like, especially a Pokemon that doesn't have an established strength, is more difficult than other starting points. It does not always, or even often, yield results. When I build teams competitively, I always start with goals for my team, and then find Pokemon to accomplish them. When you start with the Pokemon because you like it, you're searching for a problem to solve, which is putting the cart before the horse. That being said, it's a lot of fun to battle with Pokemon that feel unique, and not every team you build has to be intended for top play. In most cases, players who are most interested in winning with their favorites or will have a Pokemon in mind which they build around, the first thing to do when building around or forcing a specific Pokemon is look for what it does well, which can give you some idea of strategies you can employ. Ideally, your Pokemon will have some strength or goal that sets it apart from other Pokemon. The less tools your Pokemon has access to, the more challenging your task will be. If you decide to build around Chimecho, for example, you may struggle a bit, but if your favorite Pokemon is Incineroar, I have good news for you. When you choose to build around a specific Pokemon, you have the advantage of having a starting point based on that Pokemon's intrinsic strengths and weaknesses. If you've already identified how you want to use your Pokemon, that will provide even more guidance. But even without a central strategy or moveset selected, you can still begin building. Oftentimes, I'll choose Pokemon for my team without deciding on the moves or items, and once I have an outline, I'll go back and fill in the structures of the team. Which of your Pokemon's base stats are the highest? Does the Pokemon have any unique moves? Is there something this Pokemon does better than other Pokemon can? Does the Pokemon have any tools to manipulate speed? Can the Pokemon support its partners in a unique or meaningful way? These starting points should get you thinking about what your Pokemon can do well, which leads us into our next step. Identifying your Pokemon's place in the format. Now that you've identified your Pokemon that you want to build around, some things they could do well, and some things they could do well, it's time to look broader. You have a square peg, and now you have to find a square hole. Start looking at which Pokemon individually as well as combinations are popular, and consider if your Pokemon could be used against any of them. If you aren't sure what's popular, you can watch videos of playing or check out usage statistics. Some things to consider about if your Pokemon is strong against other people's popular Pokemon include: does it have a type advantage? Will you move first? Does your opponent's strategy do you make your opponent's strategy more difficult to execute? Does your Pokemon allow potential partners to be more annoying for a opponent? Will your Pokemon be difficult to remove while meaningfully contributing to the battle? Does your Pokemon disrupt opponent strategies in a meaningful way? Write these answers down so you have them for later. Once you have an idea of which popular Pokemon your pick will match up against, it's time to think about the Pokemon you're weak against. You have some things your Pokemon does well now. Great. However, every Pokemon has its weaknesses, and it's time to think about yours. When you were considering which Pokemon you had an advantage against earlier, did you notice there were any matchups that were unfavorable? Are there any Pokemon you really don't want to use your favorite against, or that you need to remove in order to win your favorite? This is a two-step process. First, identify the weaknesses of the Pokemon you choose. Then, start to consider how to deal with them. Countering Pokemon is actually really difficult in VGC, so it's important to have a number of answers for threats. Some helpful tools to include are adding synergy, Pokemon that can switch in when you want your favorite to lead the field, good defensive type, add Pokemon that offensively pressure the Pokemon that your favorite is weak against, adding Pokemon that enable your favorite to have a more positive matchup when it checks against its checks, and adding Pokemon you can use to handle your favorite threats while keeping it safe off the field. Again, write what you brainstorm down One thing that helps me personally during this step is to look for broad weaknesses of my chosen Pokemon, such as being generally weak to steel types or Pokemon that are faster than 110 base speed. With weaknesses outlined, we're ready for our last step of the process. Once you have a starting point, you're going to need to build the rest of the team. That process will be extremely similar to the process we described in this article. You'll fill out the rest of the core that works with your favorite Pokemon. You'll think about what core is strong and what is weak, and then you'll finish off your team. The only difference here is that we're totally focused on making this Pokemon the star of the team, and we'll be orienting most of our other choices around its strengths and weaknesses as we identified in the above sections. It's tempting at this point to focus on the usage statistics of a potential Pokemon partner and overcompensate in either direction. You might say, I'm using a very uncommon Pokemon, so I'll have to add some top usage Pokemon to make up for it. Or say, I want to go totally off the deep end and use a bunch of Pokemon that no one's heard of. There's nothing wrong with either thought process, but try to instead focus on your team's goal and what you'll need from the Pokemon that you're adding in a later process. Once your team is done, give it a shot on the ladder. It may take a couple of iterations before your team is comfortable with how it plays and how its strengths and weaknesses play in battle. Pokemon is interesting in large part because of the creative choices that a player can make during the team building stage. Some people enjoy team building around their favorite Pokemon or Pokemon that receive less attention from other players, perhaps because it allows them to express their creativity openly from the minute the battle begins, or because building such teams is a unique challenge. Team building with these goals in mind, however, is not all different from team building Team building with these goals in mind is not all that different from team building in a general case around strategy or idea. However, it does require a certain honesty in your thought process. What are the strengths and limitations of your centerpiece Pokemon strategy? For some people, the joy of winning and with their favorites makes up for more than just the difficulty of playing in this team style. Moving on, we have Eevee. Eevee sprites offer the most customization out of any element of VGC, outside of selecting your Pokemon from the team. Now, at first glance, it can be daunting. Although Eevee sprites have a significant amount of impact on the game, the skill of making spreads is not taught, or even mentioned in the mainline Pokemon games. There's no one-size-fits-all answer for each Pokemon, and ultimately it's challenging to know without experience whether your spreads are helpful or detrimental. All these factors combine to make crafting Eevee spreads an opaque process seems seemingly complex. We're going to start you off with the absolute basics of constructing Eevee spreads and give you the strategy that will be straightforward and effective. You'll be able to build from this foundation in later articles. Eevees are going to change your Pokemon stats. What that means is it practically differs based on the stat that gets Eevees. For speed, Eevees change when your Pokemon moves in a turn. For all other stats, Eevees change how your Pokemon's attacks and defenses will interact with the damage formula, which guides how much damage an attack deals. The damage formula is complex, and we don't expect you to know off the top of your head. We certainly don't. Here's a screenshot from the Beagle-Latest damage calculator that shows damage calculation. This Excadrill has 252 EVs and an attack. Sylveon has 252 EVs and HP and 4 in defense. You can see that Excadrill will do between 98% and 115% of Sylveon's max health. If Excadrill had less attack EVs, this attack would do less damage, and if Sylveon had less HP EVs, this attack will do more damage and maybe even guarantee the knockout. The most important part of battling is to know what the Pokemon on your team are capable of. The EV spread simply changes your Pokemon's capabilities in battle. Each of the Pokemon on your team was added to your team for some reason, and the EVs are for the most part going to help it carry out the purpose. Before making an EV spread, think of yourself, why did you put that Pokemon on your team? Then set out to make that EV spread with that goal in mind. A simple EV spread focuses on the Pokemon's strengths and may be intended to be general purpose. The most simple EV spread of all is maxing out 2 of the Pokemon's stats and then putting the last stat point in the third. This is a 252-252-4 spread, or a max-max spread, because 252 is the maximum amount of EVs that a Pokemon can have in a stat. For example, I might have added Kartana to my team because I want to take advantage of its fast physical, fast fighting type moves. If I've chosen to have it or hold the focus slash for survivability, I'm going to max out its attack stat so it does more damage as much as possible, and its speed stat so it's as fast as possible. I'm also going to give it a Jolly Nature which boosts its speed and drops its special attack so I can outspeed all Pokemon below 109 base speed. I'm adding Sylveon to my team for its strong Hyper Voice while being a fairly bulky for strong Hyper Voice while being a fairly bulky but slow special attacker. Sylveon isn't a naturally very fast Pokemon, so I'm not going to take advantage of its speed. I'm going to max out its special attack so that it deals as much damage as possible, and then put the rest of its points in HP so that it has more health to survive with. With my last 4 EVs, I'm just going to put them in defense, its lower defense stat. Speed is the most important stat. This is something we'll drill into your head again and again when you're making EV spreads. Be mindful of the speed stat that your Pokemon ends up with. If a Pokemon's speed stat is higher by 1 point, it will move first. And that 1 point is the difference between winning or losing a game. If you're going to give a serious thought into any aspect of your EV spread, make it the speed stat. You can do that by checking speed tiers and usage stats. When deciding what you want your EVs to do, there are generally 2 approaches. You can lean into the strength of a Pokemon, or you can try to decrease that Pokemon's weaknesses. One important general rule is that at the most value for a stat point, the lower the stat is. This means that a point of special defense on a Kartana, base 31 special defense, will have a much larger impact in the damage formula than 1 point of special defense on Blissey, base 135 special defense. This isn't to say that you should always be investing in your Pokemon's lowest stats, but you should be aware that those are diminishing marginal returns. On a side note, you should always invest 3 or 5 stats on your Pokemon, never 2, 4, or 6. The short exclamation is that you have 2, 4, or 6 stats, you end up wasting EVs that can go somewhere else, not to be wasted. We'll explain that more in depth later. When making a simple EV spread, it's best to use the nature that improves the most important stat for that Pokemon. If moving first is essential for this Pokemon, you may want to give it a speed boosting nature such as Timid or Jolly. If it isn't, you may want to boost an attacking stat like Adamant or Modest. If your Pokemon is defensively oriented, you want to boost its defense or special defense. Whatever nature you use will drop a stat at the same time. Your strategy here is to minimize the attack stat while that you use the least. If your Pokemon is using physical attacks, drop the special attack stat, and vice versa for special. Utility moves that do slight damage shouldn't factor into your calculation here. If your Pokemon is operating a Trick Room, consider choosing a nature that drops its speed so it'll move even slower. In extremely rare cases, you might not want to drop either attack stat, and you might want to drop speed. As a last resort, you can also drop in defense stat, but we don't recommend this as your defenses are extremely important. In VGC, here are some of the most common natures you'll see. Jolly, Timid, Adamant, Modest, Brave, Quiet, Bold, Relaxed, Impish, Calm, Careful, Sassy. Here's how we advise making a simple EV spread for each of your Pokemon. Is your Pokemon holding a Focus Sash, or is otherwise fast and frail? Base speed around 96 plus, base speed and HP defenses around 60 to 70 or less? You'll probably want to maximize its speed and either attack or special attack, whichever is relevant, considering that nature's speed boost drops the irrelevant attacking stat. Is your Pokemon mid-speed, base 60 to 95? Mid-speed Pokemon are the most challenging to make EV spreads for. This is a great time to check out the speed tiers and usage stats. Take a guess, with speed, it'll be obvious over the course of the game if it's a good number, and you can always adjust later. As a good rule of thumb, there's a popular species of Pokemon, or a Pokemon speed that it can KO, and your Pokemon can KO back. You probably want to outspeed it when possible. You can't decide either 252 speed or 252 HP is probably a good call. With your leftover EVs, probably think about your team's Pokemon's role on the team. If it's to take out a specific Pokemon with a super effective hit, for example, Arcanine attacking Ferrothorn, feel free to put the points in defensive stats, however you see fit. If you want to be dealing more damage in general, put points into an attacking stat. Is your Pokemon going to be dealing damage in Trick Room? You probably want to maximize its HP and attacking stat. If HP is much higher than its defensive stat, e.g. Snorlax or Hyperior, put the points in the defensive stat. Keep speed as low as possible and think about what Pokemon you're outspeeding and underspeeding. Is your Pokemon defensively oriented? Tailwind, Trick Room, Light Screen. Go straight to EV and defenses. Pick a defensive stat to put into EVs based on the Pokemon's stats, and EVs into defense and special defense accordingly. Split evenly or even-ish if you can't decide. Be careful where these Pokemon with these Pokemon. If you have too many, you may not be able to get enough offensive power to win games. Your Pokemon holding EV Elites. Maximize its HP to get the most out of the defensive boost. Then split evenly between the defenses. Make a metagame judgment or dump EVs into the lower stat, which is more effective in the damage formula. I hope that this guide helps you understand some of the intuition behind EVs and EV spreads and how to apply them to your team. This is the first of a spread of EV articles and is intended to be more of an introduction. Put some EVs on your team and try them out on the ladder. In the next article, we're going to be talking about how to make EV spreads more complex, but this is not a necessary step for battling. Now, for the time being, we're going to be skipping these two. I don't think they're going to be necessary for getting Master Ball tier, and also on the terms of just having time. We're about 3 hours into the stream, so we're just going to try to finish off here and then get into team building. This will be something I revisit later, however probably just not in the videos or the streams. What is 6 Pokemon Syndrome? 6 Pokemon Syndrome is a term my friends and I coined to describe the situation where the final Pokemon you want to add to your team has too many roles it needs to fulfill. If you ever found yourself in a situation where you really like the core 5 on the team, and feel like if you just can't figure out the last perfect pick, you'll have a great team, you're likely struggling with 6 Pokemon Syndrome. As you narrow down what your last Pokemon needs to be able to do through testing and refining your team, you may find yourself looking for some miraculous Pokemon that fixes all of your team's problems. When your core has too many weaknesses and the 6 Pokemon can not fix all of them, it's typically an issue with the first 5 Pokemon on your team. 6 Pokemon Syndrome isn't actually about the 6 Pokemon, it's about the first 5. If I think I have 6 Pokemon Syndrome, what should I do? Try other Pokemon in the last slots. Having exhausted all your options, if you like a core, it almost works, keep trying with different combinations. 6 Pokemon only happens after you've tried a bunch of options and none feel right. Pay attention to how far down in the usage stats the Pokemon you're trying out. We don't think the usage stats are law. Looking at Pokemon with extremely low usage rates can be an easy sign that you're reaching though. Accept the flaws of your team and press on. Every team is going to have weakness, and yours is no exception. No team will be able to cover all of its flaws. As time winds down closer to an event, you might have to make compromises or accept flaws of your team. Furthermore, not every weakness is totally worth changing your team for. Being weak to the most common team might be worth fixing a weakness, but for a random loss on the ladder, you might not have to change anything. No matter what, it's up to you whether you like where your team is at. If you can accept the weak points of your team and you like your team, don't feel like the 6 Pokemon is too much of a burden. You probably shouldn't be changing much at this point. The most heartbreaking end to a team with 6 Pokemon Syndrome is needing to take a big step back and change major aspects of your team. This step can be a challenging one to take. It's a lot of work to build a team, and teams are kind of like art in that they feel extremely personal and it's easy to get attached. Sometimes you gotta rip the band-aid off. In this scenario, you can revert to a much more scaled back version of your core. What are the most important elements of them, and what are your favorites? Could you have built them around a different angle or new perspective, and try to scale down to 2 or 3 Pokemon that you think absolutely need and work from there. Or you can ditch your team entirely. This can hurt a lot to think about, and if a tournament is approaching quickly, it can induce anxiety. But in some cases, the best way. It's definitely worth your time to have built a team, even if you have to move on from it. For one, you gain more experience and learned a lot about the Pokemon that you used on your team. Maybe you found subtler elements of your team that aren't quite a core that you like enough to put onto another team, however you built it. It can be painful to lose battles. It can be even more painful when you realize that despite your best efforts, your team isn't going to work out. Critically evaluating how the final Pokemon or the 6 Pokemon addresses the main problems of your team can help you realize whether your team will sink or swim in the current metagame and competitive environment. If you're working on a team and you find yourself changing the last Pokemon repeatedly and never feeling satisfied, it may be a problem with the larger structure of the team as a whole, and you might want to take a step back. After a bit of time in playing with formats, you might be rather fed up with some of its Pokemon. I'm sick and tired of losing to Incineroar. You might think, screw this, I'm going to build a team that beats it every time. If this sounds like something you said during team building, you're not alone. Different Pokemon frustrate us all the time. What you're looking for is good matchups, and you want to be favored to win when you play against that Pokemon or strategy. It's natural to want to build in a better matchup against certain opposing Pokemon, especially those with strong ones with high usage rates. In extreme circumstances, you might even consider a counter to that Pokemon. A Pokemon counters another Pokemon if it invalidates it in a variety of circumstances. The word counter tends to strongly imply that it always beats the Pokemon target. A softer concept is a check, which generally means it is favored against the opposing Pokemon. Though not all the time, counter and check words are words borrowed from singles. Look here for more information. Given the complexity of double battles, finding a good matchup or a counter to a Pokemon is not always straightforward or an easy task. and in some cases, it may even be more of an aspiration than an achievable goal. In this article, we'll go over what countering means to us, and how we go about building better matchups versus the Pokemon that we hate to fight against. Some common misconceptions. It's impossible to knock out a Pokemon 100% of the time. This may work in singles, but in doubles your enemy can do a lot to prevent you taking a knockout, such as Fake Out, Follow Me, Rage Powder, protecting that Pokemon, switching in Intimidate, getting speed control. At the end of the day, your opponent can always switch out of that Pokemon and attack you with its partner. Simply surviving in a Pokemon's attacks, walling isn't going to cut it either. If you have a wall Pokemon that can survive an attack from an enemy, but it can't damage it quickly in return, the enemy can always target the wall's partner and come back for the wall later. Some Pokemon are too powerful to be immediately countered. Some enemy Pokemon will have a large effect on the battles that they are brought to, and it isn't impossible to have one Pokemon whose job it is to beat it. That's not saying that those Pokemon can be beaten. There are always ways to beat enemy Pokemon, but doing so may be more than a one Pokemon job, and it may require careful thought over the entire structure of your team. There are a lot of enemy Pokemon out there, and if you're tunnel vision on beating one, your team may suffer overall. If you have one Pokemon whose main job is to beat another and it does nothing else, you'll only be able to use it effectively in games where that enemy appears. This is a crude example, but in your VGC, your Pokemon often need to work flexibly together, and if you have a Pokemon that is only our team to accomplish a minutely specific goal, you may be at odds with the rest of your team. Because of these reasons, we advise you to make it your goal to find good Pokemon, good matchups, Pokemon, strong in general, have a variety of situations that you're useful in, and happen to be useful against the Pokemon that you want to beat. How do I find a good matchup? First, you have to identify the strengths and weaknesses of the Pokemon you're trying to beat. What is it good at? What about its options and gameplay do you want to beat it so badly? Make a list. Some things you could include are is their offensive coverage strong? Does its defensive stat and typing make it hard to hit for high damage? Does the Pokemon have utility? Does anything else about it stand out, like its speed? Does the Pokemon have unique moves or a unique style of playing that give you a tough time? Now, look at the Pokemon's weak points and find Pokemon with tools that help you beat that Pokemon. You can always find ways to hit that Pokemon for high damage, maybe super effective. However, think about what will happen if that Pokemon has utility support. Make sure you can still beat in most of the situations as well. Is the Pokemon frail? Consider options that can outspeed and knock it out, including priority. Speed control can help in this situation. Does the Pokemon have reliance on other conditions? Rain, sun, check room, etc. How do you counteract those? Look for utility moves that are useful versus that Pokemon's strength. Does the Pokemon lack offense? Consider the Pokemon that can ignore its utility and setup or summon in some way. Is the Pokemon weak to strong status conditions, burn or sleep? Finally, test your idea. You want to make sure that your team is working well against the Pokemon that you're targeting. What do I want to find a counter attack? This situation comes up when you have 4 or 5 Pokemon that you like, maybe a core, and they're weak to one enemy Pokemon in particular. In that situation, adding a Pokemon gives the enemy Pokemon a tough time and can make your team much stronger. Maybe you want to add a Pokemon that focuses on beating the enemy Pokemon a counter, or you want to add a Pokemon that is useful in other situations, but is merely favored against the target enemy Pokemon a check. The strength of your response depends on how challenging that Pokemon is for you to fight and how often it appears on opposing teams. How to beat a combo or a team? Sorry, one sec. Okay. Rather than beating one Pokemon in particular, you might want to beat a combination of Pokemon or even a whole archetype. Maybe you have 5 Pokemon that work well against a number of teams. There's one team that's strong against you, and you would like to add a 6th Pokemon to beat that team frequently. Beating combinations, modes, cores, archetypes, and teams is more challenging than beating a single Pokemon, and often you won't find a Pokemon that does it on its own. This is because you have to consider the strengths and weaknesses of each individual Pokemon that you would like to beat, as well as synergy between them. A Pokemon is often more than the sum of its parts. It feels easy to look for one Pokemon that counters all of its human by itself. Excuse me. And you can scroll through the list of available Pokemon to find something that's with just the right typing, but often a dream Pokemon doesn't exist. Here's what to do in that situation. Follow the steps in the above sections and identify which aspects of make each of these Pokemon so strong. Now, follow these steps again by trying to identify the strengths and weaknesses of their synergy. Why do those Pokemon work so well together? At this point, if you have laid out most of the framework of the team, you might not have many slots free on your team. Brainstorm some Pokemon that have good matchups against the synergies that you have identified. It's unlikely that you'll find a good one Pokemon that covers everything, but it's worth thinking about. You never know what you'll find. Evaluate how it synergizes with the Pokemon that already exist on your team and see if there's any synergy that is particularly useful against the enemy Pokemon. Maybe test some attempted solutions on the latter. If that doesn't work, it may be the case that you have to take a step back and use more than one slot to beat these particular enemy Pokemon. Now, brainstorm the combinations of strong Pokemon that would match up well against the synergy that you've identified with. At this point, it's synergy against synergy. Can you find Pokemon that with synergy that make life harder for the enemy Pokemon? If you haven't started building yet, but you want to match up against a team that you're looking forward to at a starting point, start from this type synergy. Do something strong with your core that is naturally advantageous versus the Pokemon that you want to beat. As always, test your ideas to make sure they do work in practice. When you build and test teams, you'll often find flaws in the team quickly and want to plug up those holes with Pokemon specifically designed to fix them. However, as I've shown above, it is a tall order to beat counter Pokemon. Consistently beating strong Pokemon is challenging at best and nearly impossible to do in the most skewed metagames. And adjusting the Pokemon on teams to work against the Pokemon that you want to counter is where a lot of the time is spent during team building. At the end of the day, if you can pull off a team that is naturally advantageous versus the Pokemon important threats that you identify, many of your battles will be easier to win. Oh my gosh. Excuse me, one sec. Okay. If I ask you what the key difference is between single and double battles, you'll probably say that the primary difference is the number of Pokemon on the field at any given time. What's less obvious is the various ways in which the difference in the number of Pokemon changes the ways in battles progress. In this article, we'll make a case of why you want to think twice before adding purely defensive Pokemon to your team. What are island Pokemon? One of the key elements of double battles is how Pokemon interact together dynamically. Your two Pokemon on the field will work together in harmony. They'll attack different Pokemon, use supportive moves, or defend each other. Because the interaction between your two Pokemon is important, Pokemon that are typically successful in VGC have an immediate or near immediate impact on the state of the game. This is sometimes called board presence. Impact on the state of the game can take the form of offensive pressure or supportive pressure. Most Pokemon need some offensive pressure because without it, there's nothing stopping your opponent from ignoring that Pokemon while they destroy the rest of your team. We coined the term island Pokemon because the Pokemon is isolated and often just watches as the foe ignores it, kills all of its partners, and deals with it in the end by abusing constant 2v1s after all of the teammates have fainted. In single battles, these traits may not be as much of an issue. Let's look at a Pokemon like Toxapex. Toxapex is incredibly bulky with a Pokemon with good defensive typing that does damage using Toxic, gradually wearing down the opponent over time. In single battles, this strategy is highly effective and challenging to counter. So why is this more defensive approach not work in doubles? Well, the key word is gradual. In order for it to do damage, it needs Toxic to stack up. Even if we assume that Toxapex has a favorable matchup, it still has the bulk to answer both threats. This strategy still wouldn't work because Toxapex has to have a second Pokemon with it on this field at any time. So you try to use Toxapex to stall out your opponent's health as Toxapex whittles away at them. There's nothing stopping your opponent from continually attacking Toxapex's partner Pokemon. Now, obviously, using both of your Pokemon to attack one of your Pokemon opponents is a pretty rudimentary strategy when it comes to double battles. There's more going on here. Toxapex offers no immediate offensive pressure. It doesn't threaten nearly any of the Pokemon in the short term. In single battles, this is fine because Toxapex is able to use sponge damage and heal, but in doubles battles, it won't cut it. It cannot heal or defend its partner. In fact, many popular defensive strategies in single battles don't translate well to double battles for this reason. The defense needs of Pokemon are different in double battles. For this reason, we don't attempt trying to stall or strategies that include walls in your team. So are all defensive Pokemon island Pokemon? Some defensive Pokemon still exert pressure. Many defensive Pokemon have been seen success in VGC. The question is you need to ask yourself is determining whether a Pokemon might be an island Pokemon is, can my opponent safely ignore this Pokemon without consequence? This explains why extremely defensive Pokemon like a Mungus or Smeargle are not island Pokemon, as ignoring them results in either status or attack redirection. Even Pokemon like Dusclops, which typically only uses Nightshade and Pain Split to the advantage, are not island Pokemon, as the chip damage makes Dusclops difficult to ignore. In summary, when deciding whether or not to put a Pokemon up on your team, ask yourself, what is this Pokemon doing, and do I think it'll be safe in most cases for my opponent to ignore? If the answer is yes, consider using a different Pokemon. Not every Pokemon needs to be putting out tons of damage in order to be contributing to the battle, but every Pokemon does need to be an active participant. So, when do you move on from a team? There are ebb and flows to each team's performance. You might find yourself winning a tournament one weekend and losing quickly the next. It can be especially disheartening to lose with a team you once found success with, or with a team you really like. You might feel that you need to move on or try a different tactic, but you're not sure if it's the right thing to do. This is a natural selection that many VGC players find themselves in, and here are our tips for when and when not to play the favorite team behind you. You can only bring one team to a tournament. For this reason, usually players have one team they're currently working on at a time. Moving on means stopping work on this one and picking up a different one. Note that moving on does not mean that it was a waste of time. You definitely learned something by building or battling with it. Furthermore, although main goals on the new team might be different, you can potentially include your favorite concepts from your original team as well. Finally, it's okay to leave one team on a shelf and come back to it later. Moving on doesn't mean you're done with the team forever. When you return to an old team with a fresh perspective, you'll often fix old problems in new ways. Move on if you're not having fun battling. VGC battling is something that I enjoy. If I'm not having a good time, I need to take a step back and reconsider my thought process. Having fun with a team is one of the first things that I look for when I pick teams for serious high-stake tournaments. But it applies to any context in which you'll play VGC. If a team doesn't feel fun, it may be a sign that the underlying thought process does not click intuitively, or that you have some underlying issues. A good goal in VGC battle is to control the game and force your opponent to react to what you're doing. Furthermore, when you're in control, you'll have many options for possible moves. Your team may not be doing your favors. If you frequently find yourself forced to make certain moves or risk losing the game instantly, misplays during battle are not always at your fault as a battler. If you're frequently losing games because a prediction goes wrong for you, that may be a sign that your Pokemon don't let you fully take control of a game. Move on if you realize the metagame has shifted to become unfavorable. One reason that you might struggle is that a recent metagame development has disadvantaged your team. Adjusting in this case can be as easy as changing one Pokemon or its moves, which we definitely recommend thinking about. Sometimes the goals of your team are fundamentally weak to what you see on a majority of teams, and that could be either due to bad luck or maybe the metagame has turned against your team in particular. Your options are either to stubbornly choose the uphill battle with your current team or to switch to a new strategy. We recommend the latter. If you're running into a rough patch on the ladder, however, that isn't always representative of the metagame. Rather than instantly throwing your team out the window, reevaluate in a few days. Sometimes portions of the ladder get weird and you didn't notice the same trend the next week. This scenario, more if your opponents are too prepared for your team's options. This scenario can happen when you're playing a common team and your opponents have clearly have countermeasures, or if you're running a non-standard element on your team that isn't consistent enough to beat your opponents. In the former scenario, where your opponents respect your strength, if you feel like you're at a disadvantage every game, it may be worth thinking about whether the metagame has accommodated your team. This is not always an insurmountable barrier, as many Pokemon are strong enough to resist counterplay measures. However, you'll have to take a step back and think about how to use your Pokemon in this situation, and maybe switch up either play or the details of your team to better respect your opponent's counterplay. If you don't like that your opponents are understanding of your team in the first place, you'll definitely want to change things up. In the latter scenario, where your opponents seem naturally ready for your tactics, it may be worth reconsidering weaker parts of your team overall. Move on if you're just tired of everything and it doesn't work. Sometimes a team almost works, it's very close to being a complete concept but it's missing the mark. You've tried everything with that last slot but you're not finding the success that's so close by. It's a case of 6 Pokemon syndrome, which we have a separate article on. In this scenario, it's much more likely that the first 5 Pokemon on your team are the culprit of the team feeling incohesive. Take another look at a team, and if you find a great solution, great. But if you keep trying and nothing works, it may be worth dropping the concept partially or entirely. Caution, reconsider before moving on if a big tournament is close. Are you writing in this article because a tournament is close? This is not us. Wrapping up, it's not only a challenge to say goodbye to your team because you need to start over, but also because it's personal. We invest a lot of time and creative energy into our team. In the most extreme example, a team can feel like an extension of ourselves, and thinking that it might be flawed can feel like inventing a weakness in your own philosophy. Know though that your job as a team builder and team selector are separate. When team building, you have to be creative and follow through on your ideas. When selecting a team to battle with, you have to be honest with yourself and factually evaluate your team's strengths and weaknesses, especially if you're picking a team for an event that you care about. If you don't want to move on from your team, you don't have to. But it's great to have a team that you feel comfortable on, and you shouldn't lose that because of a moment of doubt. But if you're generally feeling on the fence and your team doesn't meet the criteria above, you might want to consider making something new. And lastly, the very last article we have. Why you should keep an open mind. Pokemon team building is about making a whole lot of decisions. To make things a bit easier, many people look at what others have done or what is currently popular in order to make their own decisions easier. For example, taking a rental code that succeeded in some tournament, putting a Pokemon on your team because it has a high usage in the statistics, or picking a particular moves for a Pokemon because it has to have them. Making assumptions and working quickly is a completely fine thing to do when building a team, but also has some risks. Test your ideas, namely the risks that you don't always know, is how your ideas are going to work out. Assumptions are linked to the skill of theory mod, or knowing how a Pokemon team will function together in your head before you ever battle with it. When you have the time, it's better to test an idea or a move or an EV spread rather than write it off as good or bad without seeing how it actually works in practice. Testing your ideas is a great way to discover strong niches about a Pokemon trend that are currently being undervalued. Of course, part of testing is effectively is learning how to identify whether something is strong or weak when you test it, which is a topic for another article. You also don't need to equally distribute the time across testing your ideas. Often even one game is enough to tell that the idea isn't going to work. Sometimes ideas that don't work will lead you to your ideas that will. Being able to identify the strong fall points, trends, or concepts on a team can push you towards something strong, even for ideas that fail. Additionally, you want to eventually be able to use ideas that aren't already known to be strong. You'll need to experience for yourself. Identify good starting points and supplemental pieces, even if it's more challenging than taking something already established as good. When team building, you want to give yourself more freedom by questioning every aspect of your team, from the broad reason you chose each Pokemon down to the last EV and move. Being especially intentional can be a strength when used to make smart creative choices that push the envelope of the team and showcases ideas that are not already popular, but is also intensively time and effort consuming, and can be a hindrance if the choices you've made don't hold up in practice. Not every tournament winning team has a novel idea, though many do. Finding the balance between creativity and established strength is a difficult skill that is necessary when deviating from the norm. As with everything, there's exceptions to our guidelines, the biggest one being when you're on a time crunch. In this context, it's when there's a deadline for your team to be ready, normally for a tournament. When the clock is ticking, assumptions are great. By working with ideas that you already know are strong, you can iterate on a team faster. Additionally, assumptions are only a negative thing in team building. Assumptions are a necessary component of most high-level Pokemon battles. A few disclaimers: people tend to get very attached to their own teams, to their own original ideas, especially if they want to go against the grain. I'd strongly encourage anyone who wants to build creatively to try and remain as objective as possible about their own ideas so as to improve in the long run. It's good to remember that team building is subjective. I often see established players immediately ruling out a new player's idea on the basis that it hasn't been seen yet. Even if someone else doesn't think an idea has merit, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the case. There's very rarely one right way to do things in Pokemon. And on that note, we have finished everything for team building. And I will come back to this. However, for now, it's been about 3.5 hours of reading, getting ready for this. So I'm gonna take a break. I will stream my team building thought process later. But for now, I will be back later. And I'll see you guys next time. Because I am gonna go take a well-needed break. Thank you for anyone who was watching. I hope it was as informative for anyone